Ladies and gentlemen of the internet, my name is Mark, and welcome to another episode at this point of my ranking of all the new roguelikes and roguelites I've played so far. This is a direct sequel to my original tier list I made a few months back, where I ranked all like 80 plus roguelikes and roguelites that I had on my Steam library. If you haven't watched it, I suggest watching that first, especially if you're interested in seeing some of the more popular roguelikes I've already covered. Since then, I've been playing many more roguelikes that I want to review, as well as talking about their overall design. For those that do not know me, hello, my name is Mark, and I really like roguelikes. I've been working in the video game industry for many years in many different fields, including playtesting, game designing, composing, sound designing, engineering, and voice acting, while also having played thousands of hours of over 130 plus roguelikes and roguelites at this point. Alright, let me quickly explain how this is going to go. First off, once again, this is my own opinion of these games. If you disagree, then good. Let's have a conversation. Feel free to express yourself in the comments below. I do tend to read all of them, and I always find it really interesting to see different point of views on all of these games. These are all games that have at least very positive reviews on Steam, meaning that all of them have great potential, even if I didn't personally have an amazing time playing them myself. I honestly respect all of them. I've also included a few games from the previous tier list that I've decided to change ratings. All of the music you'll be hearing in the background comes from these roguelikes. You can find them in the description below. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can skip to any game you want just by checking the timeline of the video and looking for the particular title that you want to see. I will be covering every game in alphabetical order. And feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. It really helps the channel out. All right. First off, we've got Alina of the Arena. This is a deck building game with a fairly interesting mechanic where you play as this character on a board and you use cards in order to move around and attack enemies. So this is kind of like a mixture of classic like Slay the Spire deck building gameplay with a bit of kind of like Into the Breach board-focused like movement mechanics. Now this game, I didn't really know much about it until someone randomly mentioned it on stream, I think, said that this was like their favorite deck-building game. I looked it up, not many people were talking about it, but I'm always intrigued about a lot of niche games as well. I think they can tend to have some pretty unique designs and mechanics. So I took a look and I started playing it, and I kind of fell in love with it. I'm currently working on a video talking about deck building design. In it, I specifically talk about how I find it really crucial for deck building games these days to have a unique mechanic or a design in them. Otherwise, they're just gonna usually feel just like a Slay the Spire clone. So I find it always important to see what is that unique mechanic. Every time I start one of those new deck building games, I'm always curious what is the gimmick of this particular game. And it can be risky because sometimes you're going to try something that is super weird and niche and it might not work. But in this instance, I think this game did a phenomenal job at still keeping things very close to Slay the Spire. I mean, like, there are some cards that are almost identical, some keywords that are exactly the same, and design them around this whole board that you're going to be playing around. I think it's done very well. I think the cards themselves are really well done. You can have a lot of different builds, which is great. It doesn't always feel the same. There's a lot of different characters you can start off with. Differently than Slay the Spire, you don't have unique cards per character, but each character does start with a unique deck and unique abilities. So there's not as many cards as you would find in a game like Slay the Spire. Overall, there's not as many builds that you can find. I'm willing to bet that if I were to play this for many, many hours, eventually I would find similar builds from one another. That being said, from the amount I've played so far, which is maybe like 10-15 hours, every run I've done has been very unique, and I've had an absolute blast between each of them, playing different characters. There's also a really nice sense of progression. There's 3 floors, and each floor visually looks different, which is always a big plus for me. And the bosses are fairly unique with cool mechanics. There's a lot of different encounters, so it doesn't feel too repetitive in terms of what you're going to be fighting. The balance, I think, is a little bit off in some aspects. I think anything that's movement related is super, super powerful, and you can kind of get away by just having a lot of movement stuff. And the fights tend to be fairly long. Even though they're really fun, and it's kind of cool to see the different strategies. It is generally, some fights can last a long time, especially with the different kind of builds. If you're playing for a defensive build, you're going to be stuck for a very long time, which can be a little much at times. There's also a fun little twist at the end, which I'm not going to spoil, regarding like a little story aspect that I was not expecting, which is cool. Some fun little lore. If you're a fan of deck building games and you like strategy, like board games, kind of like Into the Breach, FTL, that kind of stuff, I think this really combines these two genres very well, surprisingly. And I'm really happy that this random person recommended me this game, because I think that Alina of the Arena is going to be a solid A tier that I'm looking forward to seeing if it's going to continue growing. I think the game could have even more content. It doesn't seem too hard to add content to this game. You can design new cards, new characters, new bosses. There's still plenty, but I could see this grow even further. So yeah, big thumbs up for me. Good game. Next up, we've got Astrea, six-sided oracles. This is another deck building game where instead of having cards, you have dice. And this is going to be a common trend we're going to be seeing more and more these years as deck building games are getting more popular and people are just trying to find different ways to make it look unique instead of just always being a Slay the Spire clone. This is one of, like, I think 3 dice deck building games I'm going to be talking about on this stream. And I'm kind of happy to talk about this one first, because this one is really interesting from a design standpoint. When talking about a deck building game, usually it's going to be turn-based, which means that it's going to have a fairly big focus on strategy. Even though you have to draw cards and there's RNG randomness upon like what cards you're going to be drawing, there's still usually a lot of strategy that you can really plan around and like do your turns accordingly. But the thing is, when you're talking about dice deck building games, this concept gets a little bit trickier because every dice has multiple sides. So not only are you drawing multiple dice, I mean, depending on the game, but you're going to have multiple dice, but when you roll them, it's a 1 in 6 chance that something's going to happen. So you're reducing the amount of strategy just because everything is way more random. It's kind of like as if Slay the Spire, for instance, like a card like Strike that deals 6 damage. It's as if you were playing Slay the Spire, but every time you played Strike, instead of dealing 6 damage, it was deal 3 to 9 damage. You could still kind of strategize around it, but the strategy is reduced quite a bit because of how random these are. And that's why I think that a lot of dice deck building roguelikes kind of struggle to have like a nice blend of strategy and randomness. But this game does it very differently in a way that I really, really respect. You see, every dice is going to have really drastically different effects. You're going to have like one side is going to be like just deal 1 damage, deal 2 damage, deal 3 damage, and then receive 1 damage, receive 2 damage, receive 3 damage. You're like, what? So a lot of them also come with negative effects. I think every one of them, to an extent, come with negative effects. But basically this game is designed around the concept of taking damage. You want to take damage. You can see right here, the little bar here, right there, that's your health. And every time you take damage, that bar goes lower. And when it goes lower, you activate new abilities. And so you're trying to go low, high, healing yourself, dealing damage to yourself, healing and like taking damage. And the whole concept is that you want to take damage and you want to heal yourself. Therefore, that means that any die has potential, whether it's taking 1 damage or receiving 3 damage or dealing 3 damage, all of them can be used effectively. So even though you are rolling these dice randomly, you're always going to be able to benefit from the effect no matter the outcome of the die in general, compared to a lot of dice games. And I find that amazing. The design of this game is really, really impressive. Now, that being said, this is a complicated game. This might be one of the most complicated deck building games I've ever played. The fact that you only have 6 health and you're constantly going back and forth in terms of like taking damage and going back up, things are constantly happening. It's really hard to keep track of a lot of abilities. This game has a ton of keywords. All different characters, you can play 6 different characters. All of them have really, really unique keywords. We're talking like 10 different keywords per character. And each of these keywords are very complicated. And not only that, but since these are not cards, it's visually harder to just see what the dice does. You kind of have to remember them pretty well because you're just going to be rolling these dice and you're just going to see the little icon and you're like, I think I know what this is, as opposed to seeing like a full-on card where it's usually visually a bit easier to understand what's going on. So this game is really complicated and fights last a long time. Just to give you an idea, every floor, there's only like 3 fights. You're only going to be dealing with 3 enemies at a time for each floor because fights are very long and very strategic, very complicated. So this is not for people that are not very familiar with these kind of games, but for those that really like a challenge and then love like strategy-based games like these, this is really awesome. I'm very, very impressed with it. There's also great music. The art is amazing. The VFX are great. Visually, everything looks great. I will say I kind of wish that between worlds, things were a little bit different colors. As you can see, everything is blue. That's kind of the point, is that there's blue and red. But it makes it kind of hard to know which world you're in. And it's not as immersive when you go to another world because it kind of looks the same, kind of. I wish it was a little bit more, more colors in the background. That's a little thing, but it's not a huge deal. Overall, this is a really, really solid game that I would recommend to people that are very, very familiar with these kinds of games. There's also a secret boss that you can fight only if you've beaten the game with all 6. Yes, with all 6 characters, so it takes a while. It's nice, it gives you this sense of like progression that you want to know what is that final encounter after having beaten the games many times, which is not an easy game once again. And when you get to that final boss, I think the final boss, the fight itself took me like an hour. It's that epic and it's that big. Something interesting is that the first default character you start with, I think, is probably the least interesting. So that's kind of annoying because I think the other ones are much better to start off with. There's unique events, there's unique like sentries you can have with you, like little friends, and they have their own design and mechanics. There's a lot to this game. I think this is a really, really solid game. Yeah, I would recommend it to people that are really comfortable with deck building complicated roguelikes. But this is going to be a solid A tier for Astrea. All right, next up, we've got Atomicrops. This is a bit of an older game in terms of like roguelike standards. This is one that I know a lot of. There's a big fan base around this game, and I hadn't played it before, so I tried it out. And I think this game has a lot to. There's a lot to talk about in this game. So basically, this is a top-down shooter, kind of bullet hell, but also a farming simulator. Question mark? There's 2 parts of this game. There's the part where you're pretty much a farmer. You have your crops. You're planting seeds. You're cultivating. You're farming stuff, I guess. And then there is the fighting portion. And this is kind of similar to just like a very basic top-down shooter. It's nothing too crazy. It's not trying to be super crazy in terms of the gameplay. The gameplay itself is super straightforward, but you wouldn't want it to be complicated. It's not always a good idea to just put a ton of different like mechanics into an action game in order to make it more interesting, which we'll see actually pretty soon. When I first tried this game, I wasn't sure how to feel about it. The tutorial is pretty bad. The tutorial is kind of like, oh hey, like haha, funny, this game is ridiculous. You plant seeds, you grow them, you cultivate them, and that's it. That's all you have. And then you start the game and you are just overwhelmed and you have no idea what's going on. And visually it can be very chaotic, but more importantly, there is no pause function during the gameplay. What I mean by that is that when you are farming, you need to also be dealing with the action at the same time. This is not divided. And that's going to feel really, really tough at first. The fact that you need to be building, like planting seeds, doing a lot of different actions while you're also keeping track of bullets and shooting enemies is a lot. And so I can imagine a lot of people being discouraged by that. But outside of this, the gameplay itself is really, really entertaining. It's very satisfying, but also you would think that this game doesn't have a lot of like unique like builds and abilities you're gonna find. No, this game really surprised me. that almost every run I will find unique passive abilities that I've never encountered before that completely change like the way I would the way I would approach the farming and the battle. It's really, really interesting. You can have like a pig build. You can have like a chicken build. You can have a bee build, and all of these can have unique abilities, and then they can help in farming, but also combat. There's a lot to it, and I was really surprised by the amount of unique abilities you can find. Also, a bunch of different weapons. You can also marry certain NPCs, and they will give you unique things. You can see right here. So you can try to choose which one you want for your run. Also, runs are long, which is kind of expected for this kind of game. You're going to be spending a long time each run before you get to the end. I've completed this game a few times. I think 3 times on easy, and then I started the higher difficulties. And the higher difficulty got really hard very quickly. And there's like 8 different difficulties. I'm not sure. I am not someone that's played this game a lot. And I can say that if you're really comfortable with this game, I could imagine this being amazing. That being said, I do think this is, once again, another game that's really hard to get into. The information that's presented to you is kind of confusing, but more importantly, the fact that the farming and the fighting happens at the same time is really, really rough, especially when you're trying to plant certain things in a particular position to try to do combos. There's no, like, removing... Like when you plant like a tree, for instance, you can't remove that tree. So you're trying to plant in a particular position to try to benefit for the positioning of everything. And then like you're being shot by everything and you're trying to position it correctly and you're like, I'm trying to, That doesn't feel great. And I kind of wish, I know some people that love this game are not going to be happy with me saying this, but I really do think that if there was some way to have a limited time like time stop effect just for farming, so you could just position things accordingly for just a few seconds, I think this game would be more approachable for a lot of people, and I would personally think that would be more interesting, so that I could not feel crazy pressured by just like, oh, I'm just gonna place this somewhere, and then I realize that's not where I wanted it to be placed, which can feel pretty bad. Outside of this, the game again is really, really satisfying. When you get a bunch of crops, the late game is super cool. There's a bunch of different bosses. There's a lot of ways to approach every run, which I really like. This is a roguelike where you would feel like it's always going to be the same, but it's not, because it's the amount of content this game has. This is the kind of game where if I was stuck only having to play a certain game for a long time, this could be one of them. Even though it's not going to be an S tier for me, I could easily take this over another S tier if I had to spend like hundreds of hours on, because I feel like you could really do a lot with this game. There's also some roguelite elements, but they take forever to unlock just because of the nature of how slow the runs are, which is cool. I do like that. You know, it makes every run feel really unique and really important. So I like that. I would not recommend it to a lot of people. But I do understand where the whole like fan community comes from in this game. I think it's a really, really solid game, and that's going to be our 3rd A tier of the day so far. It's pretty much a chaotic multitasking sim for the insane. Exactly. And I know some people will like that. I mean, I like the concept of it being like a chaotic multitask. When you start playing this game, you're going to find a lot of unique passives like scattered around the world. You have to make a choice between them, and you want to read them, and you want to because you want to know what they are. There's so many of them, but you can't really because you're so pressured on time, because yes, you only have a few minutes before sun goes down and things are like shooting at you, and you just want to read what that ability is, to know if it's worth picking up. I wish when there was like an option to choose something, there would actually be like a menu where you can like you pick it and then like you choose between those two, and it's like, again, paused. Because even though I like the chaotic aspect of it, I think it just is so mean for new players to be forced to try to read super quickly which ability to grab while you're being shot everywhere, and while like you have like 20 seconds left before it's sundown. Next up, we've got Balatro. I don't think I've seen another roguelike just kind of pop out of nowhere and explode on the internet. This game is everywhere. The amount of YouTubers and content creators that I follow, whether it be for like just gameplay or like talking about design of video games, and I've made a video about this game, blows my mind. It's a solo dev, and it came out of absolutely nowhere. This is a deck building roguelike, but the mechanic behind it, the unique twist, is that it's poker. And that's about it. And this game is really, really interesting. I understand why it got so much hype. Now the question is it overrated? Is the hype too much compared to what the game is? No, I don't think so. And there's many reasons for it. First off, this is a deck building game that is really, really easy to understand. Usually when we talk about deck building games, they, like we said before, there's a lot of mechanics, a lot of keywords, a lot of things you have to get used to. But not with Balatro. Balatro really keeps things insanely simple. I would say it's probably one of the simplest deck building games out there. Even though it takes a different approach than like a game like Slay the Spire, it is still pretty much a deck building roguelike. They give you a quick tutorial about, you know, basic poker stuff. You don't really need to know anything about poker in order to play this game, by the way. They say, okay, well, you just have to do poker hands, get some points, and you win. And that's about it. And I think one of the major reasons why this game did so well is because of its simplicity, because of how approachable it is to anybody, whether they play roguelike, whether they play poker, whether they play deck building games, it doesn't matter. This game is super, super simple to understand. Now, it doesn't mean that it's an easy game to master. This game is very strategic, and that's the perfect blend. You want a game that is very simple in design and mechanically, but that can also have a lot of strategy around it. These are like the best designed games in my opinion, and there's a few that we're gonna talk about, and this is one of them. Not only that, the game is also insanely satisfying, and I think that's the really important word of Balatro: satisfying. You have to get a certain amount of score in order to get to the next encounter. And the scores will be like, you know, reach 300, then reach 1,000, then reach like 10,000, then 50, and then like 100,000. But the thing is, this game really utilizes the concept of being able to multiply and like exponentially get some combos and cards that will fuse together in a way that will create some insane numbers here and there. It feels a little bit like, this is going to be a weird comparison, but kind of like the Binding of Isaac, where some runs you're going to have a normal run, you know, without anything too crazy, but every now and then you're going to have a run where you find everything and you've planned around it, and then you reach insane numbers. But that's not uncommon if you know how to play this game. Even though you don't need like a crazy amount of numbers to win. You don't even get anything for getting those high numbers. If you do like 10 trillion and your goal is just 100,000, it doesn't matter whether you do 100,000 or 10 trillion. But it's just satisfying, and people don't care. They just like seeing those big numbers explode. It is just so fun. And so people just have been having an absolute blast with it. And I understand. I think this game does it really well. Outside of just those two like really specific design things, the game itself, the cards are really interesting. You'll have a bunch of different builds. Currently, in its current form, it is pretty unbalanced. And I think there's a lot of tweaking that can be done, but I believe there's actually a new update in like a day or today or something, where they've adjusted a ton of jokers, which are the passive abilities, which doesn't surprise me because the game is pretty unbalanced. And now with the balance change, I think this game is going to be really, really insanely good. Also, you might think that this game is a little inconsistent because you have 52 cards, but no, actually, you're going to be able to change your deck very, very quickly and find unique passives very quickly as well. So even though there's a lot of cards and you might think that, oh, trying to get a perfect hand seems like a lot of luck, not really. You can discard cards a lot during fights. You will change your deck very quickly. You will find passive effects. So even from the start, every run is going to be pretty different very quickly. And that's great. I find that to be really, really good to have a game like this that is quick-paced, fast-pacing, that you can just do runs over and over again to be different from one another very quickly. Because otherwise it would get kind of boring to start every time. So, Balatro... Yeah, I understand the hype. I think you can definitely make an entire video talking about the design of this game. Many people have already. I really like it. I think it's very satisfying, very fun. I would recommend it to pretty much anybody that just finds this remotely interesting. Because again, anybody can play it, and that's one of the beauty of Balatro. That's why it's going to be an S tier for me. Game whispers in your ears, yeah, go on, break it, break the game, do it. Yes, it really does. The game really pushes you to, like, try to break the game. And it's one of the easier games out there to break, and yet still feel rewarding for doing so, because it's not like super easy to do. You still need to understand the mechanics around it. So it's a game that rewards you, like good playing by breaking the game. And it's super satisfying. Also, something I forgot to mention is that the normal difficulty goes infinite. But pretty much infinite. Basically, like, you will lose eventually. So even if you have reached like trillions and trillions in numbers, you can continue and continue and continue and get your deck better and better and better, and eventually the game is going to catch up to you. And that's amazing. That's super fun, and you don't see that very often. To my understanding, this is one of those games out there where even though there's a lot of different difficulties, and you know, most deck building games are trying to scale up the difficulty once you beat it, this is one of those games where a lot of people don't want to actually go up in difficulty. They just want to have fun and play on the normal, easy mode, just so that they can get those satisfying, like, game-breaking builds. And again, it just really proves how fun it is to be rewarded in a roguelike by breaking the game. Which is, once again, why Binding of Isaac is... one of the reasons why Binding of Isaac did so well. And this game as well. Next up, we've got Barony. Barony is one of the older-ish roguelikes. This takes kind of like a classic approach from like these first-person like dungeon crawler games that we would used to have back in the day. I'm not too sure where to get started on this game. This is this game is not for everybody. When you're looking at the game currently, you would think, okay, this looks pretty straightforward and pretty simple and fun, and not really. This game, to some extent, it's a little comparable to a lot of the top-down strategy roguelikes that are really complicated. You can start with a lot of different characters. You can have a different class. Each class plays drastically differently. Just to give you an idea, the tutorial of this game is a gauntlet. It's a gauntlet that most people have not even finished because of how long and complicated it is. The tutorial is an entire mansion, and each mansion, like in the mansion, there's doors, and each door will bring you into a new like challenge area that is honestly really hard to do. The tutorial, like, most people will not be able to do because of how complicated this game is. I would suggest people to look up a beginner's guide to how to play this game whenever you start, because of how intense this game is. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Minecraft in some way, where there's just a ton to do and a ton that you can understand. You can play as a basic fighter, which, you know, just like your sword and shield. Cool, simple. But then you can also play as a rogue, and then you have to find ways to like get behind people. But then you can also be an alchemist. An alchemist, you can find different recipes around, and you can fuse different things. But you could also play as an engineer, and as the engineer, you can create different robots, and if you get different robots, they can also have the robots do particular things that can also create more robots that you can then also use to fuse things with robots and like alchemy, maybe? I don't know. There's a lot of ways to play this game, and effectively, if you know a lot about this game, you're going to have an absolute blast. But getting to the point where you know a lot about it requires a lot of work. I do tend to enjoy these kind of games, and I will say that I've played this game for about 15 or so hours. That seems to be the trend for a lot of these games, apparently. And even after 15 hours, half of the things that were going on, I just wasn't completely sure what to do with them. The game is insanely punishing. Runs are very long. It's going to take forever for you to get to like late floor. And on that late floor, you're just going to be hit by a trap and you die instantly, and GG. The game is pretty punishing. Can be really rough in that regard. You're going to grab an item and you think it's okay to grab it, and then you realize it's cursed and now your run is dead. Once you understand how a lot of these things work, that's fine, but it is just not for a lot of people. That being said, I could imagine this game being great multiplayer. I'm willing to bet this is where the game shines a lot. I'm not much of a multiplayer roguelike guy, so I'm not going to review it in that regard, but if you're looking for like a really big like content-wise game to play online, multiplayer roguelike-wise, this could be one of them. I could definitely see it. Another one of those games where if I was stuck to having to play one game for a very long time, I would probably pick this, because I know that I would not get tired of learning new stuff every now and then. Another thing I have issue with is I find the game repetitive at the start. With how many things you actually need to build towards, from if you change different classes, like being able to find unique abilities, unique things. Also getting to like newer floors takes a while. You're always going to be on the same floor at the start. You're always going to be finding the same few enemies, and you're always going to find the same few items at the start of most runs. Every time I die, I'm just like, ugh, I just want to I want to try again, but I want to skip the first few floors because of how repetitive it is, even for someone like me who hasn't played this game an immense amount. But again, this game is very full, a lot of content. The gameplay itself is super straightforward. As you can see, it's just literally like you have an attack, and you go boop, and you go backwards, boop, you go backwards, boop. But of course, with the amount of different ways to approach fights, even though the gameplay itself is very straightforward mechanically, there's a lot of ways to approach fights individually, whether you want to be a spellcaster, whether you want to use traps, robots, alchemy. You can find NPCs, and you can have a particular class, I think, that is all about having a bunch of NPCs. There's a lot of different ways to approach things, even if mechanically the gameplay is super straightforward, which is what it doesn't want to be super complicated in that regard. I don't know where to rate this, because personally, I think the game didn't feel super satisfying for me. When I would go super far, after like 45 minutes, I find a new floor, and then I die instantly to something that I didn't understand, and then I have to restart with like nothing, and it takes forever to build anything. It requires a lot of patience and a lot of dedication, and I can understand people that are a huge fan of this game. I totally get it. I see why you're a big fan of this game. If you spend a lot of time on it, I'm sure I would have an absolute blast as well. It's going to have to be like a very high B tier, potentially an A tier, but personally, not really a game for me. But if people say that it's an S tier, I totally get it. Just using spells can feel confusing, or switching items. Yeah, with the amount of stuff that you have to keep track of, like sometimes you might be in the midst of battle and you're trying to figure out, oh, what's the button, or how do I use the spell, and then you don't really use a spell, or you take damage and you kind of lose. Again, something you're not going to encounter later on if you're very comfortable with the game, but for newcomers, that is a little rough. There's not much you can do about it. It's just kind of like the nature of the game. But I can understand that a lot of people are going to be a little discouraged by that kind of gameplay. I think I saw someone seduce a rat to fight for them once. But again, that's the beauty of this game, is that there are so many things you can do. The game almost feels a little D&D-ish in terms of like, there's a lot of ways to approach things that you might not even have considered. It's like, why if I tried doing this and it actually worked, and you're like, whoa, okay, cool, that's kind of fun. So it has its ups for sure. Next up, we've got Below the Stone. This is a Terraria kind of games. You go into the underground and you dig, you find gems, you find stuff that you can then come back to the surface and get upgrades, rinse and repeat. Now, I've played a lot of these games. I tend to really enjoy them. This game I just found randomly. It's currently in early access, and I was kind of excited to have like an actual roguelike that kind of uses this fairly traditional like design gameplay wise of just digging and finding stuff and then creating more stuff. And I've got to say, I was very disappointed by it. Currently, you're looking at this and you're thinking there's a lot of content, and it looks like there's a lot of content, but my big issue with it is that there's really not much to do. The gameplay is very, very repetitive. Even like from the start, I think I found everything there was to find. I found a bunch of different biomes. Every time you go underground, you're giving like different quests. The quests just kind of never change. It's like beat a certain amount of bats, beat a certain amount of ooze. I'm like, cool, I do that, and then my quests are done. I could come back up if I want to, or I can continue exploring. And if you continue exploring, you just find more minerals. Cool. And then you find different biomes, and each biome is just pretty much just the same. It's just a different biome with just different minerals, but they're not unique. It's just like the upgraded version of whatever mineral you had before, and that's it. And then when you create new armor and new weapons, they're just the same, but with better stats. There's nothing unique between things that you find. Gameplay is also really basic, which can be okay, but this game doesn't even have like a dash mechanic or a roll mechanic. You can't really, like, you're just moving around. I kind of wish there was a dash mechanic to make things a little bit more interesting, because currently it's just you're just going in a circle and that's it. and you're just swinging your sword. I didn't think there was much to do. Usually in these games, it takes a while for you to get bored because you're always excited to find the next new things. Like, oh, but I wonder what is in this new biome, what is over there. But really quickly, I kind of like did everything. I maxed out like the bank. It's been a little bit, I kind of forgot exactly all the details, but I remember that it just felt like I didn't have anything, I didn't have a particular goal to reach. And that just didn't feel super exciting, and it didn't make me feel like I wanted to explore. So for me, it kind of feels like Stardew Valley's mines a little bit. You know, Stardew Valley's mines is not like crazy, but the thing is that there's other things in that game. While here, there's really not much. I can see this game having a lot more potential. You just add a lot of content. You add different things to do, maybe more mobility, personally. All the different variations of items are just the same, but with better stats. There's nothing really, I mean, maybe you'll find a sword that does something a little bit different, but generally, everything is kind of the same with just different stats, and I just don't really like this kind of approach. I love exploration. I love looking at different, seeing new biomes. I'm a big fan of Terraria myself. But here, yeah, I just got bored really quickly. So I'm definitely going to keep on taking a look at this game whenever it gets an update, because I do feel like with a lot of added new content itself, the mechanics behind it, the design is straightforward, but it can be very satisfying if it makes me feel like there is a reason to explore all of these biomes. Currently, it's not a game that I really had a great time with personally at the moment, but I'll look forward to seeing what kind of updates it gets, hopefully, and I could see this game definitely being more enjoyable than it is currently. All right, next up, we've got BlazBlue Entropy Effect. A bit of a mouthful, but this is a pretty straightforward 2D action roguelite, I guess. Kind of like a hack and slash. What you see is what you get. Super fun. It's very gameplay focused, with great visuals. Now you can see this game looks pretty big. It is. There's a big, I mean, I think there's a fairly big team behind it, but in any case, there's a lot of work put into this game for sure. There's a lot to this game. The developers sent me this game originally to review it, so thank you once again for doing that for a game that is honestly pretty impressive. This game is not like super unique, which is fine. Usually a lot of action-based roguelikes don't need to have crazy unique mechanics or design for them to be entertaining or enjoyable. That being said, this game, what it does a little bit differently, I would say, than a lot of other games, is it really tries to push the action to a bit of a fighting style. Fighting genre, where it almost feels like a fighting game in some ways, because you're going to be picking a lot of different characters. Each different characters will have drastically different movesets. Each of these movesets, you can do different combos with them by doing particular inputs at the right time. So it is super satisfying, and each run will feel fairly different. Basically, you're going to find different movesets per character throughout your run, and I would say, in general, each character can have 2 to 3 different possible builds that is viable. So eventually, it does feel a little repetitive, in my opinion, because once you've played all the characters like twice or so, you're going to realize that there's not much more that you can do that's going to be super unique per run. But that's already, that's already a lot, right? There's a lot of different characters. I think there's like 8, 9, I'm not too sure. And if each one of them can have 2+ builds, that's a good amount of runs. And again, this is just an overall, that's kind of how it is. Of course, runs are going to be different from one another. There's a lot of different abilities you can find outside of the character itself. You are also going to be offered like some elemental abilities, like when you do this, a fireball occurs, or when you do an attack, a little blade storm happens. These are always going to be the same, and honestly, they're not super interesting. I think what's super interesting to me are individually the characters having different movesets. In my opinion, some of these movesets are much more powerful and much more enjoyable than others. So once again, it can be a little repetitive, especially since overall each room you're just fighting a bunch of characters and it takes a while, and it's just overall a little bit repetitive, basically. But the thing to keep in mind is there's a ton of bosses. We're talking like 20+ different bosses, and each boss is really design in a unique way. They all feel drastically different. As you can see, this is one boss, this is another boss, this is another boss. They all look different, they all feel different, they all have different mechanics. So the bosses is really where things shine, in my opinion. That's where things get really cool and interesting. There's also a huge focus on the story. And I find the story really good. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of effort put into the story. There's some unique cutscenes, a ton of them. There's a ton of NPCs that will that will give you different information about what's going on. You can choose different paths, I believe. Also, you can't progress like this. You can't progress the game unless you go talk to particular NPCs. So there's really a big focus on that. It feels like a little bit like an RPG in that regard, and that's really cool. Visually, it's stunning. The VFX are great. The sound effects are great. There's, I brought that up last time when I was streaming it. The voice lines. Every character like does particular voice. Have particular voice lines when you do certain attacks and when you jump. And for some reason, there's no cooldown on that. So some characters, if you just jump constantly, or if you have an ability that makes you jump, and you can spam that, you're gonna be hearing that character scream like 3 times a second, and it's just kind of weird. This is like, it's not a big deal, of course, but I find it really interesting that a game this impressive as something that to me is kind of like, It takes a while to do everything that the game offers. You're not gonna be seeing every boss for a very long time. It takes a while to see every boss. The final boss is super epic. It definitely feels like an anime, like a traditional like anime fight, like final boss. That being said, one of the issues that I have as well is, as you can see, with the game looks beautiful and it's super flashy, and you can really see the attacks just exploding, and visually it's really stunning. But one caveat that comes with having such like distinct visuals is that it can make it really hard for a game like this to see everything that's going on visually. If you take a basic pixel art game, if you have an attack that's about to happen, you can just have like a little flash of red, and it's super distinct because it's not as extensive as a game like this. So it's much easier to see certain things. But in a game like this, unfortunately, with the amount of work put into it visually, it's going to be hard to see certain things going on visually. And unfortunately, I've lost a lot of my runs to just not being able to even see what the boss was planning on doing. Especially for the final boss, which I'm not going to spoil, but the final boss kind of teleports around and does certain attacks, and you don't know if he's charging an attack or if he's already doing an attack. You don't even know if he got hit. Also, sometimes you can see, like, right here, the attack that the enemy was doing was red, so you can kind of, like, evade red attacks, and you would think that's kind of be a common thing, but no. This enemy was purple. This is green. It's gonna take a little bit to get used to not being able to see everything super clearly. But overall, I mean, once you get to understand the different boss movesets, then you can kind of like factor that into it. Also, I just have to say, there's one random little enemy that shoots yellow projectiles, and nobody else shoots yellow projectiles. And so you always get hit by it because you're just so not used mentally to have to evade something yellow coming up to you, especially in a game that's super fast paced. So that can be a little frustrating. But overall, the game visually is impressive. It's very satisfying. The gameplay is really cool. It's cool to try out all the different characters and see how different it is to play all these things. I think the game is repetitive also because there's not many unique events, not many unique like levels. It's gonna feel fairly similar gameplay wise as well as just event wise. So there's that to keep in mind. But it is really fun, and visually, as you can see, it's really impressive, even if sometimes hard to see at times. But overall, BlazBlue Entropy Effect is going to be an A tier for me. Probably here. Next up, we've got Cavity Busters. This game. All right, so this game is a top-down, like, bullet hell shooter. Now, this was actually a game that I played for one of the series that I do on stream, which is playing games that have been sent to the channel for me to review or playtest to an extent, depending on the kind of game. But this game is out, and I thought this game was so interesting that I had to talk about it. Visually, first of all, you're going to look at this and you're going to have a lot of questions. I also had a lot of questions. This game actually looks fairly straightforward if you know a lot about, like, you know, bullet hell top-down shooters. That being said, let me tell you, this game is pretty unique. The first thing to mention is this game is super chaotic, and not in the gameplay aspect, but in the mechanical aspect. This honestly feels like this was a game that the developer was like had a few ideas before making the game. It's like, I'm thinking I want to do a game where you can do this. I'm thinking I want to do a game where you can actually do this. And instead of going for one of them, they went with all of them. So in this game, you have a little tooth, and you can charge a tooth, and you can shoot the tooth, and then you have to go and grab your tooth back so you can shoot again.
Or you can press a button to recall it back to you and then shoot it again. But also, if you recall it in midair, it does something unique. Also, there is a button to just have a shotgun thing where you can just constantly shoot at enemies automatically, but it also uses the same resource as health. But also, there is a mechanic where you can jump, and when you jump, the entire screen goes super zoomed out, and then you can choose a location to land, and you can try to land on enemies sometimes. But there's also a mechanic where you can dash, and when you dash into a wall, your movement speed is increased by like 3 times, and while you're in a wall, you're immune to damage only for like 3 seconds, and then when you try to dash out, you can slow down time, and you can...
This is like one of the craziest games mechanically that I've ever played. There is so much going on, and I actually think that the game kind of takes a hit by how much there is going on mechanically. It takes forever to get comfortable with all of these possible options you can do during battle. Now, on one end, it's cool that you have different options, right? It does feel like there's a lot of different ways to approach any fight, but you're just not going to know what to do for a lot of it because they all are viable and you can all use them constantly. So it can be very, very overwhelming in that regard. With something this extensive in terms of like all the mechanics, you would think that there's not much else going on within the roguelike elements, but not so much. On the contrary, like I said, this game is insanely chaotic. This game kind of takes inspiration from The Binding of Isaac, like a lot of games, of course, but in the way where you're going to find a lot of passive abilities, and the passive abilities are really going to change the way your character play. And yes, that includes all of these unique mechanics. Except that these passive effects, you're not going to find 1 or 2 per floor. No. You can find like 5 to 6 per floor. Your character is going to be filled with unique abilities that completely change the way you play the game. Which is insane. And on top of that, every floor you have certain rooms, right? But you can always use health to dig to a new room that you're gonna create on the floor. So you can pretty much expand each floor infinitely, almost, probably, depending on how much health you have. That means that on floor 1, you can be spending seriously like 40 minutes on floor 1 just because you found a lot of health and you're just digging, and then in this new room you find health again, and then you find a new ability, and you continue on. I'm not done. Another thing is that this game kind of takes a similar approach to Blazing Beaks, which is a game that I wasn't a huge fan of, but had a really interesting mechanic of having all the passives actually be negative effects that are terrible, but you're trying to keep as long enough for you to be able to exchange them at a shop for actually good items. This isn't exactly the same concept, but here, a lot of these passives that I was talking about have upsides, but also huge downsides. Like, we're talking massive downsides. You can choose to take them, or you can not take them. But if you don't take them, other things occur in the game that are negative. So you're kind of forced to try to grab them. And grabbing them can be, again, very chaotic. So you're kind of forced to take all these crazy items and adjust to these huge differences mechanically and gameplay-wise. You can get rid of these negative effects later on, but it does take a while. And it's not always guaranteed. So, overall, this game is a huge mess, in my opinion, and that can be fun. It can be fun to have things be very messy, but I think that the amount of chaos that is going on between the gameplay, the mechanics, the fact that you can spend a lot of time in a single run just because you have a lot of health, there's just too many aspects that are too chaotic for me, so it's a bit of a shame, because I think there's some really interesting concepts in there. The boss fights are really, really cool. The bullet hell experience feels great. The design of the bosses are really, really, really interesting. But the surreal amount of mechanics, I think, kind of drags it down slightly for me. Also, the story is pretty fun. There's a lot of humor put into it. There's a lot of There's a lot of secrets, which is great. This game has a ton of content. I was quite surprised with the amount of content this game has. So props to the developer on that. I might actually want to try to finish the game. I haven't done that yet. I am curious to see how like the ending looks like, so maybe I'll come back to it. But this is a game that I think deserves a little bit more work and a bit less chaos, in my opinion. Even though I do like chaos and it can be fun for a lot of people, I think this one crosses a bit too much of a line for me. So I'm gonna put this as a high C tier. All right, next up we've got a cute little game. This is a Cursorblade, I believe. This is very straightforward. It's a top-down bullet hell-ish. Basically, you're controlling your cursor, and your cursor is your hitbox. You deal damage by just physically like touching enemies and like hitting them with the cursor, and you move away by not taking damage. This game is very basic. It's very straightforward. It's not trying to be ridiculously like grandiose. I don't think it would actually benefit the game for it to have crazy content. I think this is supposed to be very straightforward. Every time you complete a wave, you get one upgrade. Upgrades are very straightforward. You know, like you spawn little rockets. Now you do little like spinny thingies. You fire damage, all that kind of stuff. The upgrades are not super impactful gameplay-wise. You're going to be playing pretty much the same all the time, so it doesn't really matter what you get, in my opinion. You're always just going to be like hitting, and then you're going to evade the enemies, and then hitting, and then you're going to evade, and hitting, and then you're going to evade. It's very repetitive. It's satisfying. It's cute. But I do think this game could have been a little bit more interesting if the gameplay was a little slower, where the cursor would actually move a little slower, and the enemies could actually do more attacks, or you would feel more of a slight bullet hell experience. Because currently, the gameplay is so fast that it kind of feels random. You're just kind of like swiping without really thinking about it, and then you're just moving around to not get hit by bullets. I do think it would have been a bit more interesting if it was a bit slower pace, so that you could have more room to introduce more interesting mechanics without it being huge. But I mean, as it is, it's cute. You know, I do think it could be honestly pretty fun for a lot of the younger audience, maybe if they want to get an idea of, you know, like a basic roguelike action experience. Maybe that could be fun. I'm not planning on playing this again. I do feel bad to put it as a C tier. It's not because it's a bad game. I think it does things well. I do think it could have been a little bit more interesting with just a little bit more thought put into maybe the pacing of it, personally. So yeah, it's not that I dislike it. Exactly. I don't want to say I dislike it. I don't dislike it. It's just super cute and super basic with a very straightforward concept. It kind of feels like a game jam, for those of you who know what that is, where people that in the video game industry kind of like get together to make a game very quickly in a short amount of time. And this feels like a perfect game jam kind of thing. Next, we've got Death Must Die. Quite the name, yes. So this is our first of many, I think, Vampire Survivor clones, which I like to call top-down horde roguelikes, where basically you're playing a top-down game, or semi-top-down, in a huge map, and you're just having hordes of enemies come at you, and it's kind of like never-ending, and you get abilities by collecting experience points, and you try to go as far as possible or until you fight the final boss. There's plenty of these games out there, especially with when Vampire Survivors kind of blew up, and because of how simple it is to design these games, there's been a lot more of these games that have been designed and released. This, unfortunately, means that a lot of these games are pretty low quality. Because of how simple they are and how popular they are, they're very approachable because they're very satisfying. People do like satisfying things, as I mentioned before, and this is like the perfect thing. It's just a huge hack and slash. You pick a button, things happen automatically, and things die around you. It's super easy to design. It's very satisfying. So there's a ton of them, and a lot of them are not great. So I was a little skeptical when I tried pretty much all of these that are on this list. Luckily enough, I will say Death Must Die is a good one. This is, once again, very basic gameplay, as you would expect. You're just moving around, you can dash, and that's it. Everything else is done automatically, I believe. But in this game, you have different characters you can pick from, and it takes it's pretty much just straight up copying Hades. It's Vampire Survivors with Hades, where during your run, you're going to encounter different gods that are going to give you 3 different boons. Each god will have different keywords, and they can combine with each other, and you can even have duo boons. It's not even trying to hide. It is literally just Hades, but Vampire Survivors, which is fine, because the different boons are really unique. And they really change the way you play everything. And just like Hades, it's very enjoyable to combine different gods to try to have different effects. So in that regard, that's really well done. I really do enjoy the different boons and the different gods that are being offered. Another aspect I really enjoy in this game is all of these games, once again, are going to be usually in a single level. That is just from top. That is very straightforward. Usually, the level design in these games is very, very minimalistic. In this game, you're going to be in an infinitely long level, pretty much, and you can explore the level, and you will find random little events and random little things to upgrade your character as you're exploring. So you can spend time just like hack and slashing enemies, or you can try to just explore really far and try to find unique events that are also going to be beneficial, because you can also upgrade your character as opposed to just trying to kill everything to get as much experience points as possible. So that's really sweet. I do really, really like that. The exploration part is really nice. I wish they would go even further, because it's hard to find really, really unique events, and I kind of wish you could find some more of those. But I think that is a nice little touch compared to a lot of other games that have similar gameplay. There's also a roguelite element where you're going to... It's kind of like a... I don't know how you call them, but like a loot-heavy game where you're going to find loot during your run. These, like your classic like RPG, like you find a helmet, a torso, that kind of stuff that you can equip to each character. So you can choose which character will have what kind of equipment. And that will stay between runs. So when you go outside of the run, you can adjust all the different equipments that you can find and stuff like that. That's cool. That being said, a lot of the equipment is really boring. It's just a bunch of stats. We're talking like a bunch of stats. You find like 20 plus items every run, and a lot of them is just this new helmet that has like plus 15 this, plus 20 this, plus something this, plus whatever this, plus a little this, plus a little this, and then you go back to the hub world and you look at your stash and you see like 60 of these, and you're like, I don't care. I wish you weren't giving as much loot. It would feel a little bit more unique if that were to be the case. Some of the equipment is really interesting. Some of them really come with unique gameplay changes, but not many of them. I wish there was less equipment and more of them were more unique. Because currently, you're going to be left with a ton of equipment all the time, and it's just kind of annoying to have to go through them. But overall, I do understand why this game did very well when it released. There's also good humor. Each character have different like dialect, and they all have their own personalities. They say funny things here and there. I wish each character was more unique. Currently, each character really doesn't do much. You would think in a game like this with all these different characters that each character plays very drastically different. Not really. Not really at all. Some characters are pretty much exactly the same. Instead of just doing a swipe, you do a stab, and that's it. The only difference you will find is that eventually you can then get like a unique attribute per individual character, but just a single one. And one of these attributes can just be like, oh, every 3 levels you get more crit. So I really wish there was more mechanics between the characters, because currently they feel a little... they feel like you could do any build with any character, it doesn't really matter. Outside of the mage, which again, the mage has a unique mechanic, because you shoot projectiles, and that feels different, that's great. But everybody else is kind of just like a melee attack, and one is a stab, one is a swing, one is a swirl. That's it. So I wish there was more care put into the characters individually. But that's how this game has nice replayability. I wish that every run would be different in terms of the encounters. Currently, each time you play a new run, it's going to be exactly the same enemies, exactly the same time. It's like 20 minutes or something, and every few minutes you're going to get exactly the same kind of waves and the same bosses. So this is definitely something I'm expecting is going to change. This was the case with 20 Minutes Till Dawn, which was another one of these games where eventually it was just a single like level with the same enemies at the same time, and then eventually with more content they added more levels with different waves, different bosses. That was great. So I'm hoping that's going to be the case for this, because currently it does get repetitive to play and to fight exactly the same monsters every single time. But that's something that I'm expecting is going to be changed later on. Currently, this is a very solid Vampire Survivor clone, however you want to call it. And so I'm going to put this as a fairly high B tier. The artwork is really, really nice. It's simple, but it fits the theme really, really well. I think it's important for these kinds of games, these horde-like games, to have an art style that complements the gameplay. Because sometimes a lot of these games, there's so much going on screen that it's hard to see what the hell is going on. But this kind of gameplay, it's super easy to keep track of everything. Probably one of the best. Like, you can really see all these little, like the big red nova. You can really see those very clearly. That's great. A massive thumbs up on that. It makes evading enemies much easier and much consistent, which is great. Next up, we've got Deflector. Deflector is another pretty straightforward top-down action bullet hell roguelite, where the little unique twist is that, as the name states, you can deflect bullets. You have different characters. Each character, you have your basic attack, you can have your dash, you can have move around, but you also have a button to deflect. Each character's deflect is different, which is kind of interesting, and you can only deflect certain bullets, the red ones. There's going to be red and yellow. That's it. I do appreciate the fact that a game like this is actually keeping things fairly straightforward instead of having a bunch of different colors and different mechanics around it. I think keeping it simple in that regard is great, because the game is actually really simple in concept. It's a very fast pace, but for something that's so fast paced, it's very easy to keep track of everything, which is once again great, and thanks to the fact that the mechanics themselves are very minimalistic. You can also pet the Ooglu something, whatever it is. He's awesome, so that's already an extra rating point for the game. This is one of those games where it mostly focuses on the core gameplay more than the unique builds that you're going to find through the runs, which is fine. That's usually two different approaches. When you look at a game like Binding of Isaac, the basic gameplay is very straightforward and it focuses more on the items. This is the other way around. The different things you're going to find throughout the run are not insanely impactful, but they still are, all things considered, for a game like this. I was pleasantly surprised. Usually for a game that has such a focus on gameplay, the upgrades are going to be fairly minimalistic, but there's still some pretty cool things you can do. You can decide to go for basically either a defensive play and basic attack play, or a deflect play, and each one of those are viable strategies to an extent. That's pretty cool. The game is very fun, but it does get a little bit repetitive just because of mostly one issue that I have, which is that, as you can see, things are really fast, right? It makes you feel like this game is boom, 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 and it kind of is at the beginning. But the problem for me that I have with this game, and the more I play it, the more I really struggle with this design choice, is that the further you are in the run, the more you're going to encounter different waves, multiple waves per level. And that really brings down the pacing of the game quite a bit, especially since the levels are fairly large, all things considered. And so you're going to be left with an enemy at the corner of a level that you're trying to figure out why is the next wave not going, and you have to kill this little grub that's not doing anything on the corner of the map, and then you do the next wave, and then you kill a bunch of enemies here, and then you go to here, and then you're like, okay, are we going to the next wave? Oh no, actually there's another grub that's all the way down there, so you go all the way over there and you kill it. It's it's not a huge time loss, but for a game that's so quick, pacing-wise, gameplay-wise, sorry, I feel like the pacing does take a hit because of it. And I think this could be changed in a few ways. Personally, I feel like the multiple waves should be just cut down a little bit. But also, I think the AI of the enemies could be dealt in a way so that if an enemy is far away and there's very few enemies left, then enemies start getting closer to you. That way you wouldn't have to deal with having to look around the room for the enemy. It's not that they're hard to find, because there's always an arrow telling you where the last enemy is. That's not the problem. The problem is that you're just spending an extra few seconds like going to the enemy and just realizing, okay, the arrow is telling me this way. I see a world where in this game, you don't have to wait. It's just constant action. Boom, 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 from one room to another. Another thing, there's not that many unique encounters in this game. Each room and each level is fun. Very, very fun because of how great the gameplay is. But I wish there were more unique events you could encounter. Because currently you can find a shop, you can find like a unique challenge. You could find something else maybe, but that's about it. I wish there were a lot more unique events, maybe mini bosses, more elites. I wish there was more content. This game has good amount of content, but with how great the gameplay is, I wish there was more. Each character is great, plays very differently, but once you've played all of them, you kind of just want more. You want different. You want a bunch of new bosses. The bosses are great, actually. I'm pretty happy with the bosses. I just want more. I think this game deserves more. Something I do enjoy as well is a lot of these games, will have difficulty scaling, right? So once you finish a run and you beat the final boss, now you can do it in harder mode. Great. And a lot of games usually it's just like increasing, like, oh, now you can play it in session 2, which means that all enemies have plus 10% health. Great. I don't like this design, and luckily enough, I would say that most games these days are learning from that mistake and are trying to do unique things regarding difficulty. This does a really good one as well. When you go into a run, you can choose 4 different worlds. They're always going to be the same worlds, and you can do in whatever order you want. And when I was playing at first, I was like, what's the point of me choosing a different world? I'm just going to pick whichever one I'm more comfortable with every run, and that's it, right? Like, you have to choose 3 out of the 4 every run. You can pick them in whatever order you want. But then I realized in the difficulty scaling, every time you start a run, now all of these worlds are going to have unique downsides, and all of them change every time, I believe. And so you kind of have to choose which world's downside you're going to go for, which means you are going to eventually have to play around with all of the worlds, even if there's one that you're more comfortable with, which is great. That's a really nice design. I really respect that. But overall, this is a very fun game that I'm definitely keeping my eye out for. It is also a game that I will probably still play without the updates that I'm hoping for, because it's just really, really fun. Even if the pacing is kind of off for me during the late game, and that I think the game just deserves a bit more content, the gameplay is really, really, really solid. And so I'm going to put this either as a high B or low A. I'm not too sure. Currently, I'm going to leave it as the highest of B tiers. And this is an easy A if it gets like a nice update for me. All right, next up, we've got, what is this game? Despot's game, Dystopian Army Builder. This is a pretty unique game. It's a auto battler game. You pretty much build a little army of guys, you get into a room, you press play, and they fight, and you see what happens. It's very basic in that regard. This is another fairly satisfying game, A lot of auto battlers tend to be fairly satisfying because you just have to prepare something and then you just let the chaos ensue. And that's kind of fun. It doesn't take itself very seriously. It's a very funny game. There's a lot of humor put into it. Now, in terms of the gameplay, the mechanics and all, the game is very basic. You have different builds you can do. Basically, you can grab a bunch of different characters, and then each character you can give them a particular class. They can be a fighter. They can be a sorcerer. They can be a defender. When I first played this game, I was really excited because I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many different builds you can do, and there's so many different classes. But then I realized there are actually not that many. In the defender class, there's only 5 possible characters you can build. You can't change their abilities. It's always going to be the same ability. So if you find a fridge, he'll become the fridge guy, and that's it. And I thought there was going to be a lot of these, but there's actually only 5 per possible class. And I thought there was going to be more. Eventually, very quickly, you're going to realize you're not going to be finding anything. Like, you're not going to be like, oh my gosh, I found like this really rare class that I can make this one guy super powerful. Not really. Very quickly, you're going to get all of the classes and characters you want, probably like halfway through the run. And then it's all about the passive effects you find. The passive effects are very impactful, and there's a bunch of them, which is great. Passives are like, oh, now all your fighters do this. The problem is, since you're not really interacting with them, it's cool, but there's a limit to how impactful that actually is in terms of gameplay. Like, yes, you're going to be stronger, but you're not going to be doing anything differently. You're still placing your units pretty much the same way almost every time. So it's kind of just more satisfying and enjoyable to watch, and it's cool to have all these different abilities, but you can't interact with anything when the gameplay is going on. And that's kind of, I mean, I know that's the whole point, but it's kind of frustrating that you have so many abilities you find, but then when you press play, that's it. You're done. You're just gonna see if those abilities work. Luckily enough, the AI is pretty good, but of course the AI isn't perfect because of the amount of different abilities that can trigger. Like, you can't really control anything. So it's kind of interesting. On one end, it's supposed to be very basic. On the other, I kind of wish you could do more, but I know that's the point of the game. But overall, I would say that strategically, yeah, there's different strategies, but it doesn't get super strategic because of how minimalistic mechanically the game is. You know, like, oh, I'm going to go for a fighter build. You just get all 5 fighters, and then you just go try to find all the fighter passives. Boom, you've got your fighter run. There's not much else you can do, because you just find the fighters, find the abilities that have the fighter move. That's it. You're done. The art style is really cute and funny. There's good humor, but it gets really repetitive in my opinion. I don't expect to be spending too much time on it. I've maybe played 6-7 hours of it, and I got fairly bored fairly quickly, but it is enjoyable. And so yeah, I would definitely put it as like a middle B tier. It's fun. It's casual. It's very casual. I like the vibe of this one. Yeah, it's a great vibe. I love the vibe. Honestly, the vibe of the game definitely helps. Definitely helps it a lot because it's really fun to watch. Next up, we've got Dicey Dungeons. Dicey Dungeons or Dicey Dungeon? Dicey Dungeons. This is a deck building roguelike, except that it's with dice. Another one of those. Now, this is actually one of the first dice roguelikes, if I'm not mistaken. Now, previously, when we talked about Astrea at the beginning of the stream, I mentioned how one of the issues I have with dice roguelikes is the RNG factor being so high, the randomness being so massive. Rolling a 1 versus a 6, that can sometimes be a factor of 6 times more impactful, right? Just purely randomly every time. And that can be hard to design around. And unfortunately, I do think, before I talk about the positives, I think this game personally struggles with this. I think this game is really reliant on RNG. And if you have an enemy that just rolls a really high dice or like rolls the perfect dice 2 times in a row, you might just lose even if you have a really good build. I think this game is very, very heavy in RNG, and I'm not a huge fan of that. Now, outside of that issue, the design of this game is insane. Each character plays drastically different to the point where it just feels like a new game. This reminds me of Backpack Hero, even though this game was probably first. I compare both of these games in terms of, in that regard, where every character is so different that it just feels like a new game. Each character here even has a different UI, completely different rules. So if you don't like a character, you can play another one, and maybe that's the kind of playstyle you like, and then you can just stick to that character. It's gotten a lot of updates to my understanding. There's a lot to do. There's a lot of different game modes, a lot of different worlds. If I was forced to play a single game for a very long time, this could definitely be one of them because there's a lot to do. But I do think the RNG aspect of it can be a little annoying for a game that can have a lot of strategy built around it, but the strategy definitely is held back by just the RNG aspect that I think is fairly high. Also, there's not many things you're going to add to your character. You're not going to find like a bunch of passive effects or a bunch of like new weapons or stuff. You're going to be stuck with just the classic gameplay of the character for most of the run. Which, again, luckily enough, each character is so unique, and so it has put so much work into the design of each character that might not be really a problem for many people. I think it's a solid turn-based game that I wish wasn't as RNG-based. Even there is a lot of strategy around it, and I know people that are very comfortable with this game will do much better than people that are not. I'm not saying this game doesn't have strategy. I mean, when I'm comparing it to Astrea, Astrea always uses like low rolls or high rolls effectively. Here, there's gonna be some turns where you just low roll and the enemy high rolls, and your build just cannot afford to have that, and you just lose a bunch of health, and there's not much you can do about it. It kind of feels bad. But I'm really am blown away by the amount of content this game has, and the different design behind each character is really impressive. So you could see this game as like 5 different games, because each character is pretty much 5 different ways of playing the game, which is really cool. And with all the different game modes, there's a lot you can do in it. So I'm probably going to come back to this game every now and then just to, try a few runs. Like, having a good run feels good. But having a run just lose to a lot of RNG is not super fun, especially since the runs are pretty long. So I'm going to put this as a pretty high B tier. Yeah, I'm going to put this right about here. If Death Must Die gets more updates, or like one big update, it could probably get higher than that. Next up, we've got Dreamscaper. Now, the first thing you'll notice is how visually impressive this game is. This is a basic action roguelike. I don't know how you even call them at this point. This is definitely a roguelite with a heavy focus on story. I was quite surprised when I saw that not many people were talking about it, even though there's a lot of work put into it, and there was a lot of care put into the visuals and the overall theme and mood of the game. This is a game that is divided in 2 sections, where you have the hub world, where you're playing this character that is going through a really hard time. I think she just moved into a new city. I think she lost her family or something like that. I'm not too sure yet, because it's very mysterious. There's a lot into the story that is very mysterious, and you're slowly uncovering a lot behind the story, which is really exciting. And in the hub world, you explore the city, you meet different people, different NPCs, you have conversations with them, you get to know them, you get to know their story, and at the same time you get to know more about your story. It's really exciting. And when you have a game that puts a lot of effort into the outside world, generally there's going to be a lot of roguelite elements, and this is definitely one of them. There's a lot of things you can unlock, new abilities, new stats, new rooms, all that stuff. Now, the gameplay is kind of where I have issues, because the gameplay, I mean, visually this looks great and this looks really fun. My problem is there's so much work put into the amount of content there is, and the amount of love put into the aesthetics and the outside world, that the gameplay is not bad, but it's pretty slow and quite repetitive. Mechanically, there's some cool stuff. You can dash, you have a bow, you have different spells, you can slow down time. There's a few things you can do. My main issue is the pacing is of the game. The gameplay itself is quite slow paced. Animations take a while to trigger. There's not that much animation canceling too, which can feel kind of bad when you're casting a spell and like the spell is occurring, and then boom, it occurs, but you already took damage because you were spending too much time casting a spell. Everything takes a while, and that can be kind of annoying. Even in my first few hours, I was kind of like getting bored of having to start over. I was looking forward to exploring the hub world more and to get further into the runs, but starting over, doing the same first world with the same few enemies, doing the same few things, was already repetitive, which is a shame, because everything else is really impressive, but the gameplay is just a little slow to me. The bosses are really, really cool. You can see visually, I mean, they look awesome to fight, and it definitely is. Unfortunately, there's not that many bosses. Every world is the same boss. I haven't finished this game. I only played it fairly recently. I'm probably going to continue it because I'm honestly really excited to learn more about the character we're playing and trying to go further into the runs. But gameplay-wise, yeah, all in all, this is going to be a middle B tier here, because again, visually it's great, and I do want to come back to it and try to finish and see what there is. All right, next up, we've got Ember Knights. This is a very basic, traditional top-down action roguelike. Is it even top-down? Kind of is a top-down. Yeah, action roguelike, dungeon crawler. You know, doesn't get more basic than that, but it is just full of really cool content. It doesn't try to do anything unique. This is one of the most basic games out there in terms of not trying to do a particularly unique mechanic, but it's just done really, really well. And again, usually with action-based roguelikes, you don't need to have constantly unique mechanics. You can get away with just having cool, fun fights and satisfying gameplay. This is one of them. First off, the visuals are great, and not just the art style, but the fact that each world will feel completely different visually from one another. I do feel like a lot of games, even the best games out there, tend to struggle to get players immersed within it just because each world don't look super different. Here, every world feels insanely different visually, and it gives this awesome sense of adventure. The bosses are really cool, and actually, I really love the fact that there's a boss difficulty scaling. When you go into harder difficulties, you're not just going to have a boss that has like higher scaling something. They're going to have different movesets. Even though you're going to be always encountering the same big spider of the first world, at higher difficulty, that giant spider can have 3 different forms. And each form is very different from one another. Completely different movesets. And that's really cool. That's a lot of work put into something that most players will never see, because you can only encounter these unique bosses if you play on higher difficulty. And this game is pretty hard. There's an awesome meta progression system in this game, where it'll take you a while to be able to beat the first boss because you need a lot of roguelite elements, so you really build to that. And then when you defeat it for the first time, you realize, great, now if you want to get to the final boss, you need to get like 10 levels over it to get to the final boss. That's like, wow, that's a lot of dedication. And it's great. It feels like there's something to look forward to. It takes a while to get to the true final boss. That's cool. This game has a great sense of adventure, and that's really one of the greatest parts about it. The gameplay is very straightforward. It kind of takes a Hades approach. It's pretty much just that. It pretty much is Hades in many aspects. You start with different weapons. Each weapon will have different forms that you can unlock. Each weapon plays fairly differently from one another. Same movesets as Hades, kind of. You have a dash, you can move around. You can also kind of have like a casting spell. The spells in this game are not my favorite. They feel a little disconnected from the rest. And they're trying to push spell-based builds. But in my experience, and I've completed this in the highest difficulty a few times. Pretty much the highest difficulty. The spells are not super impactful compared to being able to do a crit build. Crit builds are completely overpowered, and unfortunately, they're kind of the only way to do, in my opinion, like these really, really high difficulty levels. Is you kind of need to do a crit build just because of certain combinations are so strong that I was able to beat the final boss on the highest difficulty with pretty much being invincible constantly, just because it's very easy to kind of break the game in that regard. So there's a bit of a balance issue in my opinion, and the spells kind of feel a little disconnected personally. But that being said, I love the aesthetics. I think the game is really, really well done. It's a really fun game, probably also a really fun game multiplayer. It can get a little chaotic, especially on the higher difficulties. Enemy movesets can happen very quickly, and there's a lot of things like kind of bundled together. Overall, I think the game is really, really satisfying, very basic. So if you liked Hades, odds are you will like Ember Knights, because it's a very, very solid game in that genre. So I'm going to put this game as a solid A tier. Next up, we've got God of Weapons. This is another single level horde games, or Vampire Survivor clone. Once again, there's plenty of them, and I think it's important for them to be fairly interesting or unique. Otherwise, they're just going to look exactly the same as all the other ones. This one combines two kind of like subgenres, which is the Vampire Survivor kind of bullet heaven, I think you call them, gameplay, as well as the inventory management gameplay that we've been seeing a little bit more and more recently with the rise of games such as backpack hero and all. The gameplay itself, you just move around, you dash around, that's it. Just like most of these games. But in between rounds here, you get to have a shop and you put things in your inventory. And just like a lot of these inventory management games, depending on where you put these items in your inventory, things will do different things. And that's kind of fun. I like the gameplay, the mechanics around that. It's pretty cool. There's a lot of different builds you can go for. I do like the design of the inventory management. I think it fits very well with the Bullet Heaven gameplay. There is a few issues I have with the game as a whole. Mostly the fact that this game has a ton of content that is locked behind meta progression. And I'm talking a lot of it. So when I first started playing this game, my first 3 runs, I would encounter the same items all the time. Like, my first 3 rounds, it felt repetitive from one run to the other because I was always seeing the same things. And I thought the game was really didn't have much content. But then I realized that you could actually unlock a lot of this stuff. I was like, oh my gosh, you can unlock hundreds of items. I was like, what? And it takes forever to unlock these items. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that is required to unlock these items is the same thing you need to upgrade your actual roguelite elements of the character. Basically, what I'm saying is that you can either choose to be stronger or just unlock more items that you can find throughout the run. Which is really, in my opinion, not really fun because you want to be stronger, but you also want to find more items. I think it should have been divided because currently it felt really, I wanted to be able to beat the runs more easily so I could get more currency, and for that to happen, I would have to upgrade my character. But that means I would always be playing with the same exact weapons all the time because I didn't unlock any of them. So that I felt was a bit of a weird thing. I wasn't a huge fan of it. But once again, the game is full of content. It just takes a little too long to unlock a lot of it. I wish it was a little easier to unlock some of this stuff, or if there was different currencies. I'm not an advocate for different currencies in these kind of games, because it gets too confusing and it's unnecessary, but here I really do feel like there should have been more of a split between upgrading your character and just unlocking new things you can find. And once you've unlocked a lot of different characters and a lot of different items, this game has great replayability. It just takes a long time before it can get interesting, in my opinion, which is a bit of a shame. So if you have everything unlocked, not everything unlocked, but if you're able to unlock things quickly, I think this game is very, very satisfying. But it really does. It takes a little too long, in my opinion, to do that. For this kind of game, this is one of the better ones. So I'm going to put it probably right under Death Must Die. There you go. They're both together. It's Backpack Potato. Exactly. Backpack Potato. There you go. It is Backpack Potato. Although Potato is much faster paced. Next up, we've got Goobies. What is this? It's another one of those games. It's another top-down single-level horde roguelike. This one is really focused on not really caring much about anything and just making things very chaotic and fun. The game doesn't really care about balance. The game doesn't take itself seriously. It probably knows it's insanely unbalanced, and that's fine, because the game decides to instead focus on giving players the possibility to just kind of be completely overpowered and broken and just have fun, because it's always satisfying to be completely overpowered. This is a game that you're going to play, you're going to understand the mechanics, you're going to find out exactly how to become completely overpowered. You're going to do that a few times because it's always fun to just try to crash your computer, pretty much. And then you're going to be like, okay, well, that was fun. I'm done. There's a few things you can do in this game, of course. It's not super minimalistic, but it's pretty, again, it doesn't really care too much about balance. Every time you level up, you spin a wheel to increase a particular stat. That wheel can be either like increase your crit damage by 5%, or increase it by like 50. So again, it's really random, and the game doesn't really care. The abilities are fun, but kind of, whatever. It just, things explode everywhere. Cool. I had a blast breaking it. I've done it a few times. Once you know how the game works, it's pretty easy to break the game. There's different game modes as well, so it's not always consistent depending on the game mode you play. This is a very basic, fun game that I'll admit I was kind of addicted to the first few times because I wanted to see how much I could push this game. And I got to a point where my entire screen was a single color just because of I had like massive area of effect of explosions and like it was an absolute mess. It was very satisfying, but once you've done it a few times, you're kind of done with it, in my opinion. Oh, and also once you're able to break it, once you understand how to break it, you get points to spend on the hub world for like roguelite elements, right? So it is a bit of a roguelite, and like the first run, I got a few points. It was cool, and I was able to upgrade my health a little bit. And then the second run, I went further. It was cool. I got more upgrades. And then my third or fourth run, I figured out how to break it. I broke it, and then I could fully max out all my stats by like the third or fourth run. So yeah, it's a bit of chaos. It's fun chaos, I would say. It kind of surprised me how much fun I had, even though it's a mess. Honestly, I was thinking of putting it as a C tier, but no, I had a blast. I really did. Also, I'm actually going to put Barony higher. Can think of it. Yes, I'm going to put Goobies as like a... Yeah, it's kind of like a guilty pleasure, and I think it's going to be a guilty pleasure for a lot of people. It's fun. If you like this kind of games, you just want to break a game randomly, go get it. It's super cheap. So, yeah, it's fun. It's cute. The main character seems charismatic. Yeah, I guess you could say so. There's a few characters to play. They all play a little differently. It's kind of fun. Next up, we've got Into the Breach. This is a pretty unique turn-based game. This is developed by the same people that did FTL. And FTL was a fan favorite by many people. And I ranked it fairly high. And, you know, when they announced they were going to make a new game, I was really excited because they did a really good job with FTL. This is a board-centric, turn-based, movement-based roguelike. I probably didn't say that very well, but anyway, it's just turn-based. Every turn, you have different mechs, and each mechs can have different abilities, which include like moving something or pushing something, and you have to defend your mechs as well as the cities that the monsters are trying to destroy. So this game is very simple mechanically. Everything is really easy to understand. When you look at the individual mechs, and there's a lot of different mechs to pick from, all the different mechs have very simple effects. We're talking like you shoot a projectile two squares forward for 2 damage, or you jump from one area to another, or you push an enemy 1 square. Very simple stuff, and the enemies also have very simple mechanics. But this game is absolutely ridiculous strategically. Even though all of these mechanics are very simple, you can spend honestly up to 10 minutes on a single turn just trying to figure out what is the best outcome. Even though the mechanic is very straightforward, you have so many options. You only have three mechs or 3 or 4 mechs at a time. That is already so many options all the time. I'm really blown away by how well designed this game is. It's very simple to understand, but it is one of the most strategic turn-based games I've played with such a basic mechanic. It's honestly amazing. I'm really blown away by this game. If you like turn-based games and you like good strategy, but don't have the patience to learn like all the crazy rules of like Civilization or something like that, this is the kind of game for you, I would say. There's a lot of unique little events. There's a lot of different mechs. So like every run, you can have a different formation of mechs, so things will feel different every run. There's a lot of different difficulties. There's a lot of content in a game that's so simple. So I think this game is a perfect example of a game that has masterful design. I would recommend this to anybody who likes turn-based games. I think this is a staple in turn-based games. And I'm going to put Into the Breach as an easy S tier. Whether it be above Balatro or not, maybe. I think it's just that impressive. I think it's better than FTL. I'm not saying FTL is a bad game. I actually love FTL, but this is a phenomenal game. I understand that people would say that it's not an S tier. That's totally fine. I just think design-wise, it's perfect. It just does everything it wants to do perfectly. So I think it's kind of like a perfect game for what it is. And I absolutely love it myself. So that is an easy S tier for me. Next up, we've got Necrosmith. Necrosmith is an interesting game. I don't know how to categorize this game genre-wise. Basically, it's kind of like a very basic StarCraft. Maybe not. You have a base, and you create different monsters from the base by collecting different monster parts. They go out and do their thing, and you get more monster parts by getting more monsters that go and grab more stuff. Rinse and repeat, you go further and further and further. You encounter more enemies that are trying to destroy your base. And that's about it. I was definitely really interested in it because I loved the look of it in terms of like it felt very immersive. The fact that the world just expands, it feels like infinitely. Like you start in this little area, and the stronger your monsters get, the further and further you can go, and the more biomes you can explore, and more things you can find to add to the hub world. To your base, I guess, outside of the runs, and then you can give your characters permanent abilities, and so you can start at the same place, but expand faster and find more teleportations to get further and further into these new biomes that have new monster parts. You're really excited to see all the cool creations you can do with all the parts that you found. So, effectively, that's kind of what I got. It is pretty satisfying. It's quite enjoyable. I had fun exploring all the different biomes and finding like new monsters that do different like abilities, and it's like, ooh, cool. They had a really nice sense of adventure, which was quite immersive, and I do really appreciate that in roguelikes these days. Now, that being said, this game has a few issues in my opinion, which include the AI. The AI is miserable. Since you're creating like an army of like undead, you're gonna send them to do different tasks. They don't really do them very well. You only have like a few commands you can do, and hopefully they do them correctly. Odds are they might just run into an army of enemies and just die. And you're like, why did you die? And you can't really keep track of everything because they're everywhere. The AI is not great, and it kind of feels bad to just lose a bunch of your monsters randomly on the other side of the world, and you have no idea why. It's just because they encountered a bunch of enemies and there was not much you could do about it. So that's kind of annoying. And effectively, the game gets pretty repetitive, as to be expected. But luckily enough, the roguelite elements do help that out quite a bit, because every time you go back to your home base in between runs, you get better spells and better like upgrades that allow you to go further and further and discover these new biomes. Once you've found all the biomes, and you've seen all the cool monsters and all the cool different abilities you can find, then that's about it. Which is fine. It kind of feels more like an adventure than like a roguelite that you're trying to do new runs and new builds. No, this is more, almost feels like a campaign. The biggest issue to me is just the AI is pretty bad. You don't really have much control over pretty much anything. You kind of just let things happen, and it's kind of cool to just see the different creations and have them do their own thing, and that's about it. It's just pretty satisfying, and it does get pretty boring and repetitive after a while. But after a while, I did play quite a bit, and I did have a good time with it myself. So I'm gonna put this honestly, almost feels like a guilty pleasure, where I really did love exploring the world and seeing all the different monsters. So I'm gonna put this as a mid-beat tier. This was a pretty enjoyable game, all things considered. Next up, we've got Necrosmith 2. So I actually started playing Necrosmith not too long ago, and then I learned that the Necrosmith 2 was going to come out pretty soon. I was like, cool, that's fun. I was really looking forward to Necrosmith 2 because there's a lot of easy things to just change in the game that were just quality of life, better AI, a bit more things to do between while the gameplay is just happening by itself. And so I was really looking forward to this game. And how good is this game? I think it's a bit of a step down from the first one. Now, let me explain. The visuals are better. There's more there's more stuff going on. I guess there's more mechanics. The AI is better. You can tell you can do a lot more things with the different undead. There's a new mechanic where you can create a titan by collecting a bunch of pieces, and then you have this huge Titan. You can only have like 1 or 2 of them, and it's awesome. But I have a few issues with the game, unfortunately. And one of them is that it kind of lost the adventure part of the first one that I really liked. Because in this game, you, instead of having one massive world, you have multiple worlds that you have to choose from when you start playing, when you start a run. And there's only 3 of them. And you complete each one of them fairly quickly. So I did my first run, I died, and then did my second run, and I beat it. And then I was transported to the next world. I mean, I had to do a new run, and it was another world. And then I beat that one pretty quickly, and then I got to the third world on a new run. And then that third world took me, like 4 runs. And then I beat the game. And then it was over. I was like, that's it? I beat this game, honestly, 4 times faster than the original. Because the original felt there was a bit more of an adventure, because you were constantly go further and further and further in this one map. But here, the fact that you have multiple worlds means that when you start the run on the third world, you're immediately going to be given these really powerful minions. Which might sound cool, but for me, it kind of loses it makes all the powerful minions feel less impactful, because you always start with them from the start. And so I wasn't as immersed in the game as I was in the first one. And maybe that's just a thing with me, because I really like the exploration that the first game had. This game, for me, like the map is really small. Like you can see the outline of the map super quickly, which was not the case in the first game. So it doesn't feel as much of an exploration adventure. Also, the Titans are really cool, but unfortunately it makes things a little trivial. Basically, what ends up happening is that they're so powerful that you just leave one at your base, and then your base is kind of like you don't have to worry about your base for the next 20 minutes, and that's it. Which is kind of like there's even less strategy, even though there's more AI, there's better AI. Once you've built like your Titan, you just leave your Titan at your base, and then you don't care about your base at all. And that's a bit of a shame, because it kind of loses, once again, a bit of strategy in that regard. So even though there's better quality of life improvements from the first one, visually it looks better, I think it loses a bit of the charm of the original by not having as much of an exploration aspect, and the fact that the Titans seemed a little too overpowered, and everything kind of relies on them more than anything else. So I thought the game felt a little less free than the first one. So I'm sure some people prefer it than the original, but I personally have a more fun experience from the original than this one. And this one's going to be a high C tier for me. I was very disappointed to beat the game very quickly. It really didn't take me long for me to beat the final boss, and felt like, oh, that's it, I guess. Next up, we've got Nordic Ashes. Guess what? Another one of those horde-like single-level roguelikes. In this game, you play as different characters, and instead of finding unique abilities, you're going to level up your character however you want. So you have a skill tree, and every run you can choose to upgrade your skill tree in however manner you want, like this. Now you might think that seems less interesting, because that means that you're always going to know what to expect. Well, you're always going to find passive abilities that, you get more fire damage. So you might go more towards the fire build that the tree has. And surprisingly, that skill tree is really, really interesting. There's a lot of different options you can do in that skill tree. Even though I've played this game a lot, every different character can be played in many different aspects, even though you always have the same skill tree. There's a lot of different approaches to that because of the amount of content the game has. You can only fully upgrade a few of those abilities on the skill tree, so you always have to select which one of those 6 attacks is going to be the big one, and so that's going to already give a lot of room to have unique runs fairly regularly. Not only that, this game is divided in many different worlds. Each world takes a long time, so it's kind of like when I was complaining about Death Must Die having only 1 level, this game is that, except that there are 9 or 10 levels, and each one of them have unique enemies, unique mini-bosses, and unique bosses. And that's really cool. So it's one of the very few games of this genre that feels like there's actual exploration and there's an actual sense of adventure, which I guess Vampire Survivor does as well quite well with the amount of different levels. So I was really impressed by the amount of content this game had, and I was really looking forward to seeing what the next world would look like, what the bosses would be, and all the different characters I could unlock. There's a ton of characters to unlock. They all play obviously drastically different, with all having unique skill trees. The passive effects you find are probably the least impactful thing in the game, which is fine because of how extensive the skill tree is and the different characters are. I feel like there could have been a bit more content in terms of the different abilities you could find, but there's still plenty of them. Overall, this game is one of the better ones, once again, of this genre, but even better than the ones we've talked about. I would say this is a really, really solid take on this genre. It's probably going to be like a low A tier, but it's very, very solid, and I've really enjoyed playing it fairly regularly because I'm always excited to see the next thing I can unlock. And you unlock things very quickly, so it is very rewarding. Every time you do a run, you will unlock plenty of things. Yes, Vampire Survivor really did start a genre, just like Slay the Spire did. A few games have done that. Slay the Spire did, and that was great. Vampire Survivor did, and I don't know how great that was, because there are really a ton of bad Vampire Survivor clones out there. Next up, we've got Nova Drift. This is I don't know how you call this kind of game. It's a shooter, a space shooter, like Space Invader shooter. Not Space Invader, what am I talking about? You control this spaceship. I was definitely looking forward to playing it just visually. And yes, this is a very satisfying game with very basic core mechanics. I mean, all you can do is just move around and shoot, pretty much. I think that's about it. Then you unlock a lot of other abilities, and this game really focuses a lot on the abilities you find. Luckily enough, you find abilities constantly. You will upgrade your ship constantly. Now, even though you don't have different ships when you start the run, every beginning of the run, you will get abilities very quickly, and you will find core mechanics for every run at the very start. So at the start, you're gonna find a level, your first level, you will choose your weapon, and weapon can be throwing grenades, or a sniper, or a ray of beam, or a disc, or stuff like that. And so pretty much it's kind of like having different characters for every run, because at the start you really choose the 3 core mechanics of your ship, and you build around that. There is a lot of different builds, which is good because the gameplay is very repetitive and there isn't crazy amount of content in terms of what you're going to be discovering in the level design and the enemy design. There's a lot of bosses, which is cool, but after 4 runs, odds are you'll see most of them. But luckily enough, again, the gameplay is so satisfying by itself, and with the amount of different builds you can do, you're going to have a blast. I do see myself coming back to it every now and then, because of how just satisfying and enjoyable it is to see just different builds you can do. You can go for a friend build by having a bunch of little tiny spaceships around you, little units. You can go for a sniper build. You can go for just a high fire rate build. Every time you level up, which is very often, there are so many options, which is good. And that's really what keeps this game very enjoyable. Every build is different enough for that repetition to not feel too boring. So this is a game that I'll come back to many times, every few months probably, and that's cool. I think they did what they wanted to do very well, and so that's going to be probably the highest of 8 of B tiers maybe. Ooh, between Deflector and this. Deflector, once you get an update, you can go up a rating, I promise. Alright, next up, we've got our first of re-reviews from the last tier list. This is Nuclear Throne. This is a classic shooter, chaotic shooter game, action roguelike, actually. One of the older ones, and it's a classic. And I just want to quickly touch on this. I already talked about it a lot on my last tier list, but I think I put it as a B tier. And then, again, by looking a lot of the comments, I replayed it again. And I've got to agree that even though it's a bit of an older game, which I usually am fine with, and I said that it probably needs more that I wish it had more content, I actually want to back down on that. I think the game is really, really fun. And when I tried it again recently, I had an absolute blast. And the chaotic nature of the game is super, super fun. It's very enjoyable. And there's a lot of secrets. This game is full of secrets, and it's super cool to be able to discover these secrets even like hours into having played this game a lot. Now, it also has an awesome loop mechanic where once you beat the final boss, you can just loop the game. And some games do that, but in this instance, the loops have a bunch of unique bosses that you will not find unless you loop. It's really hard to loop. It is a really, really, really solid game that honestly stands the... How do you say it? Stands the stance of time. I don't know how you say it. You know what I mean. So I'm just going to bump from my previous rating of this game B to a solid A tier. Into games, and she hated games. I did a video about what roguelikes I recommend to start off with if you don't know anything about roguelikes. Even though it's a hard game, it's very easy to understand. And I do think a lot of people have started playing roguelikes with Nuclear Throne. And effectively, yeah, it did things super well. And so I would recommend to some people that don't play many games. Next up, we've got Ravenswatch. This is an action roguelike that is pretty much Diablo. This is Diablo, but a roguelike. Now, funny enough, a lot of people say that Diablo is kind of considered a roguelike. Well, let me tell you, that whole conversation of whether Diablo is a roguelike or not, just put that aside. This is Diablo roguelike. You have different classes you can pick from at the start of every run. You explore these big maps. You find little mini quests. You find little random events. You level up your character, and by leveling up your character, your abilities that you already have can now be upgraded with unique little attributes. And yeah, it is Diablo, but in a roguelike manner. Now, I'm a huge Diablo fan. I played Diablo 2 and 3 massively for maybe like 1,000 hours or so. So I was very excited for this because, again, I don't think there's many games that really did the Diablo roguelike element very well. And so I was curious to see how this one was going to be. This is currently in early access, so that's something important to keep in mind, because currently I think this game has a few too many issues for me to really think it's like really solid. I think the gameplay is a little clunky. You can't really animation cancel a lot of your attacks, which doesn't feel great. And one of the weirdest things about it, which is an easy fix, all things considered, is that you have a dash, and when you dash to evade attacks, the dash you can only store one dash at a time, and it has like a 3-second cooldown, which just doesn't feel right to me. Because a lot of times you're going to be evading an attack, and then you're going to do your attacks, and then you're always going to take damage because you don't have your dash back on cooldown. It feels really weird in that regard. I really feel like this game would be just much more enjoyable if there was a much lower dash cooldown, and that enemies were just more aggressive. Because currently, with the clunkiness of the abilities, like having like long animations that you can't really cancel all the time, and the fact that you have a very long cooldown dash, single-handedly makes the gameplay kind of frustrating, in my opinion. Once you've beaten it once, which is really easy, you can increase the difficulty. Unfortunately, this is one of those games where I think the difficulty scaling is done very poorly, where the difficulty scaling is not only just a percentage of like things deal more damage, but also you gain less experience points. I'm not usually a fan of games that increase difficulty by having players needing to spend more time to upgrade their character. It's not really interesting for me to have to spend more time before I can upgrade my abilities. I would rather be able to constantly upgrade my abilities, but have higher difficulty enemies. Currently, the fact that like on higher difficulty, it just takes longer before you can like level up just does not sound super satisfying. Also, on higher difficulties, these numbers scaling are really, really high. And by the end, I've played the higher difficulty where everything is just a sponge. Like, I wasn't taking much damage, but it just took forever to beat anything. I think there's too much of a sponge issue here in the difficulty scaling. Some bosses would take me like 5 minutes of me just like repeatedly doing the same abilities and evading attacks and stuff. And if I took one hit after like 3 minutes, then I would lose half my hit points. Didn't really feel great. And you would think that, you just need to get the roguelite elements up. There is no roguelite elements into this game, which fascinating. I find that really, I had to triple check. To my knowledge, there is no roguelite elements. You can't upgrade your characters permanently. Now, I don't think it's important for all games to have roguelite elements. Actually, I really think it's depending on the style. But I think for this game really does feel like it's missing roguelite elements. Because, like, you unlock new characters and you unlock new abilities that you can find, but that's it. And that's a bit of a shame because it took forever for me to beat any high difficulty levels just because everything was a sponge and I was expecting to be stronger later on, but not really. That being said, visually it's great. It definitely does bring me back to like the Diablo feel. I haven't tried all the characters, but I'm sure all the characters play very differently and you have many different builds per character. So the roguelike elements of the runs are great. And I think the abilities are really unique from one another, which is awesome. So, like, the Diablo aspect is cool gameplay-wise, but I just wish the pacing was a little different. I wish that the difficulty scaling was different. I wish, mobility really is, like, my biggest issue here for me. Also, there's a level cap, which is a bit of a shame. Once you reach level 8 on a run, you can't level up anymore, which that's not... which is a bit of a shame. I kind of wish you could just continuously level up, even if it doesn't mean that you have like unique abilities every time you level, which is currently the case. But at least give me something to feel like there's a point of me getting more experience points after I get level 8. Because once you get past level 8, there doesn't seem to be any reason to get experience points, which is kind of a shame. I wish there was a reason to do that. So there's just a few little issues here and there that for me that are kind of problematic. Personally to my experience, but a lot of these can be fixed, and that's why I'm looking forward to seeing future updates of this game and seeing the full release of it. Once again, this is early access, so I'm sure this game could be really, really solid. Currently in its state, it's going to be a fairly low B tier. Well, actually more of a mid B tier, I would say. Probably around here. Next up, with the music, as always, we've got Risk of Rain Returns. Now, I was really excited about this game. I did review Risk of Rain 1 on my original tier list. Back then, this game was not out. I've played Risk of Rain 1 a lot back in the day, and I played maybe like 80 plus hours of the original. So I was really looking forward to it. And I had a lot of trust in the developers because I think they're really great developers. They did a great job with Risk of Rain 1, Risk of Rain 2, and I was really looking forward to this remake. Now, the question is this a good remake? Did it do a good job? Oh yeah, it's good. If you like Risk of Rain 1, there is no reason that you're not gonna like this game. I think it's just a better Risk of Rain 1. They just improved it. It's just better in pretty much every way. It's really, really solid. This is a really, really good game. They really kept the core of the first one. They didn't really change much. It's still the first one. Even the art style, it's a little cleaner, but it's the same art style, which is awesome. There's more content, more characters, more items, but overall, it's just the same game, but it's just better. It's just cleaner. I mean, to be honest, Risk of Rain 1 came out early in terms of like roguelikes. Back then there weren't that many roguelikes, so they were part of like the first few like action-based roguelikes. So there was still a lot to learn, and I just think that after all these years, we've learned a lot about what makes a good roguelike, and they've learned. And there you go. There's not much to say outside of what I've already said from the original. Great diversity between the characters. This is a game that really focuses on just core gameplay. The core mechanics is what is mostly going to be fun. All the abilities you find throughout the run don't change the way you play the run. This is one of those games where all these abilities you find are not going to be super unique, which usually is not a great sign, but in this game it just works really well. And you find a lot of items, so it always feels rewarding. You're constantly going to be finding items, and the pacing is quite fast. One thing they changed that I really like is that in the original, when you defeated the boss, you didn't have to kill everything on the map before being able to move forward. That was really slow pacing, I believe. I did mention that in my tier list, that was an issue that I had with it. Guess what? They got rid of it. But if you liked it how it was before, you can change that in the options. Basically, they really want to make sure that anybody is going to be happy playing this if they've played the original. They also added some cool little unique challenges. These are hit and miss for me, but it's cool. It's extra content, I guess. It makes it easier to unlock certain movesets, which was really hard to do in the original. Here you can, once again, unlock them as it was originally, but you can also do these unique achievements instead, these unique challenges, instead to unlock these permanent movesets, which I think is great. Some people might say that now it's too easy to be able to unlock these different movesets. I think it's better, all things considered. It required too much time to be able to try to do these really unique achievements that were kind of hard, just so you can try out this new ability for this character that you really love. Here it's a little easier, and not to mention these challenges are really hard. So they're not giving you all these new abilities like that. You still have to do these really complicated challenges. So yeah, I think they did a phenomenal job with it, and this is a solid S/A tier. I'm gonna put it as a very high A tier. Probably at this point, it's probably just because I just prefer these two games over this, but that's purely my own taste. It can be an easy S tier for many people. It's great. They did a great job. Do you think there's any reason to play Risk of Rain Remake instead of Risk of Rain 2? So the thing about Risk of Rain that is kind of insane is that, when you do a sequel, you tend to, keep the things fairly similar. They completely changed everything from one game to the other. They went 3D. From 2D to 3D, that's very rare. And that's usually not recommended. They did a great job, lucky for them. But for me, Risk of Rain 1, Risk of Rain 2, even though they share a lot of similarities in terms of what's in the game, like the different items, the different characters, the different enemies, the different music, a lot of things are similar, but gameplay-wise, they're tremendously different. Because one is 3D and one is 2D. So I don't think they're comparable, even though they have a lot of similarities within the game. They're completely different games to me. So I would say, if you liked either of them, you should try the other one, probably because it's fun to just see a lot of the similarities. But gameplay-wise, it's so different that I understand if some people love Risk of Rain Returns and don't like that much Risk of Rain 2 and vice versa, because they're just so critically different. I believe Wizard of Legend is going to do something fairly similar, which I'm kind of curious about. Next up, we've got Roboquest. Now, Roboquest is very straightforward. It's a first-person roguelike shooter for FPS roguelike. There are not that many out there. For me, there are two FPS roguelikes that reign supreme: Gunfire Reborn and Roboquest. And I think most people can agree that these are really the two big ones when you look at first-person roguelikes. Now, this is probably one of the bigger games that I did not cover in my original list. And in my original list, I said how much I was a huge fan of Gunfire Reborn. And I think there's a lot of comparisons to make between those two games because they're kind of like both the big first-person roguelikes in my opinion. Now, what do you think of this game? I think this game is great. I think this is a really solid first-person roguelike. Funny enough, it does a lot of things very differently from Gunfire Reborn. Gunfire Reborn kind of doesn't have much core gameplay. You just have a gun and that's about it. And is much more focused on the abilities that you're going to be finding out through your runs. Roboquest kind of does the opposite. In Roboquest, the abilities you find throughout the run are not as impactful in comparison, but the core mechanics of being able to to like dash around and jump and like do a projector and like have a jetpack and like do different abilities from the start and like upgrade your character by himself. It's much more focused on that regard, and that I think both games do that very well. I enjoy both aspects of it. The big difference is that the runs do feel much more repetitive than Gunfire Reborn. I think Gunfire Reborn is much better in terms of replayability, and this game is much better in terms of having a unique adventure. I think this game really shines in the first like 15 hours or so. Being able to, like, because there's a lot of unique worlds you can find, a lot of secrets you can find, a ton of secrets you can find, a lot of different characters to unlock, I think. It's been a while. Different bosses you can find. So there's a lot of unlockables you could that are scattered through each run, and you won't be able to get to the final boss unless you do a particular quest, that kind of stuff. So this one feels more of a campaign than Gunfire Reborn does. Gunfire Reborn is more like straight up roguelike. The roguelike elements are amazing. This, for me, the roguelike elements are good, but I think it really shines in the overall just campaign-like gameplay that you're gonna get. That being said, it is still a very, very solid roguelike experience. You're still going to have very different builds between runs. It does everything very well. If you like first-person games, I would strongly suggest playing this. The big comparison with Gunfire Reborn is, once again, just the fact that Gunfire Reborn, you'll really have drastically different runs every time. I don't think there's much to say negatively about the game. It does things really, really solid. One of the big issues I have is spoiler territory, but that's like one of the biggest issues, is that there's so much content within like the exploration that once you get to the end, it's a little disappointing in some aspects. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on that, but that was probably my biggest disappointment with the game. Outside of that, the game is super solid. And if you like Gunfire Reborn, I would strongly suggest playing this. There's much more mobility that I think is great. Unfortunately, you do have to unlock a lot of this mobility. It does take a while, but it's okay, because even without the cool mobility stuff that you unlock halfway through playing the game, the core gameplay is still really fun. So, solid game. I would highly recommend if you like this kind of gameplay. If both games had to rank on this list, I would probably put Gunfire right over it, just barely. But I rated Gunfire very highly, and I'm also going to rank Roboquest very highly. I feel like their appeal is very different. I can understand. For me, I guess there's not many first-person shooter roguelikes, and I know a lot of gamers are big first-person shooter players. If I had a first-person shooter friend that wanted to try a roguelike, I would probably say those two games are probably the ones you have to play, and they'll probably like one over the other. There are different approaches that some people might not enjoy as much from one to the other, but I think one thing that's very important is that both of them do the first-person shooter elements very well. Even if they're different in many aspects, they're both great first-person shooter games. And that's what I think is important from both of them. Next up, we've got Slime 3K, Rise Against Despot. I don't know if I said Despot correctly, but as you can see, this is quite similar to another game we already talked about. And for that matter, they made sure that it was very similar. There's a lot of the same characters, a lot of the same enemies, it's the same animation and art, which, again, I was a big fan of the art from the other game. I forgot what it's called. That's why I'm not saying the name. It's a complicated name. Anyway, you know which one I'm talking about. This is another Horde single-level layout game. Does this game do anything unique mechanically? Not really. It's almost kind of like the equipment management game to some extent. You're going to level up and you're going to find different things that you can buy and you put into your inventory. The only difference is that there's not much put into like the actual inventory system. You can just buy different weapons that you just add to your inventory, and that's it. And you can just buy multiple of the same ones to upgrade the level of it. That's the extent of it. It doesn't get much more in depth than that. And that's, I think, my biggest issue with it, is that there's not really much to it. It's kind of enjoyable. It's fun. But it does get very repetitive, in my opinion. There's a few builds you can go for, but, you know, one weapon does a shotgun effect, one weapon does this kind of effect. But it doesn't really matter too much because the gameplay itself is kind of weird, where the slime you're playing is super, super slow, and you're expected to take a bunch of damage. There's no mobility. Usually movement is key in these other games. This one, not so much. You're super, super slow, as you can see. So that kind of is interesting. It's really all about the weapons you find and hoping that your weapons are strong enough to just push back and kill things fast enough for you to not take too much damage. On my, like, 5th run, I found an exploit to have infinite money, like, all the time, that I could pretty much do consistently, and I tried it multiple times, and yep, multiple times. Once I get past the early game, I have infinite money, and I can buy pretty much anything endlessly. So, yep, that was something I found. Also, might sound like a little small thing, but it's kind of annoying. The camera is awkwardly low. When you move down, you're not centered. The camera isn't really centered. Like, you can be really close to the edge of the screen. Like here, you can see like the edge of the screen is really close to your character, so you can't really see a lot of things going on sometimes. That's the small thing, but it was kind of frustrating. Overall, it's fairly repetitive. It's not super interesting in my opinion, because the different builds don't really matter when the gameplay is kind of always the same. You're just a blob that just moves around very slowly. It's satisfying to find all these different weapons that just kill things, but you don't do anything differently. Like, whether you have one weapon or the other, you always play the same. So it's kind of, I find it fairly boring in that regard. That being said, once again, the art style does save this game quite a bit. I love the look of it. I love the vibe. It's very cute. It's very funny. And it's enjoyable. These games are very enjoyable. And there's, like, the first times you play it, it is pretty fun. I did have a good time playing it. But I do feel like this game, it could have been cooked a little longer. That's a phrase, right? So I'm going to put this as a high C tier. Next up, we've got Space Gladiators. I mean, what do I have to say? It's a 2D action dungeon crawler roguelike. That being said, it's very basic with a lot of content. This is from the people that made Brotato. Kind of like the last game, they take a lot of the same items and same characters and just put it in this new genre, which is cool. It's an art style. Some people might not like it. Some people might. It's cute. It kind of gives like a Flash vibe. Honestly, it kind of feels like a Flash game, but it has a lot of content. The gameplay is very, very simple, as you can imagine. It's just whack and dash and jump. That's it. And it can feel a tiny bit clunky, but it's enjoyable. It's very basic, and this is one of those games that does not put much priority in the gameplay, but more on the items that you find through the runs. And you will find a lot of different items that have a ton of different abilities and play very differently from run to run. So there's a lot of different ways to play the game each run, which is great. I like a lot of the design behind some of the items in the game, and I think it does things fairly well. I just kind of had trouble with the overall, just the gameplay felt very minimalistic. And I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the art style, even though I was a big Flash game player. Yeah, it's cute, it's funny. I had a good time playing it, and I could imagine a lot of people loving this game because it really does a great job in terms of replayability and a lot of different secrets and a lot of unlockables that you can find. In terms of the roguelike elements, the runs feel very different, and that's great. That by itself is a massive thumbs up. I think the gameplay got a little dull for me after a while. It's just like, you dash and then you whack, 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 and then you dash and whack, 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 and then you dash and dash and then you whack. Or you have a spell-based build and then you use a spell from afar. Sure, I can imagine a lot of people having fun if they just like a classic dungeon crawler roguelike experience. I think they do it pretty well. It just might not really be for me. I don't think there's too much for me to say about it, honestly. It's a good game. But I'm gonna put it as like the middle of B tier. Next up, we've got SpellRogue. This is our third deck building dice game of the stream, and I believe that's the last one. I'm gonna say it one more time. I believe that deck building dice games inherently are going to face a problem with the randomness of the genre. Outside of Astrea, who did it very well, I think most of them tend to struggle with it. Unfortunately, this is another one where I do think also kind of struggles with it as a whole. Not as much as many other games. I think you can kind of get away with, even if you have a one, if you have if you roll a 1, usually you can kind of still do something with it. But overall, if you get 3 6s, it's way, way better than having 3 1s in like almost every time. Which again, that's kind of the nature of this genre. But it's also important to realize that these games are turn-based strategy games, and if you put a lot of, if you have a lot of randomness, then you kind of lose on the strategy portion of it. So this game does suffer a little bit from the randomness of the genre itself. Stylistically, it looks cool. I like the art style. Unfortunately, I think the gameplay is a little boring. There's not a lot of options during your runs. You're gonna find different spells. Each spell, basically, the way it works, that some spells will only activate if you roll a 1 or a 2. Some spells will only activate if you roll a 5. Some spells will only activate if you roll a 3. That kind of stuff. So, of course, you can like kind of build your deck around making sure that you can always cover low and high rolls. But most of the time, 6s are much more impactful. A lot of spells are like even, and the higher cost even is it does more damage kind of vibe. So it's still pretty impactful, even if 1s can still be used quite well. My biggest issue is actually not that. I actually think they get away with the randomness of it fairly well. It's not as punishing as other deck building dice games. My issue is that you're only kind of restricted to a few spells. Like I think 5 spells. You find all 5 spells very quickly. You can only upgrade them once. And the upgrade is not super impactful sometimes, and then like that's it. You find a few passive abilities, but not many. There's not many events, there's not many unique things. My issue is that effectively the roguelike elements are kind of weak for me. I think there should be more room to upgrade your spells more, find more abilities through the runs. I kind of watched the pacing was a little faster. You'd find more things that would feel more satisfying, because currently it is very slow and it's very repetitive within the run, because you're not going to get anything different from one fight to another. You're not going to, you're going to find new spells, but odds are you're not going to replace your spells very often, because you only have like 6 spots. And usually you're already trying to synergize with what you already have. So a lot of times by the 3rd floor, I barely changed my build whatsoever. And that kind of is, that can be a little boring for me. So I very quickly got bored of this game. And another aspect, there's also no roguelite elements, which is fine. I feel like this game would be nice to have a little bit of roguelite elements because of how slow the pacing is. It feels like every time you're going to do a new run, it's going to be the same things and nothing's going to change because you didn't have any permanent abilities. You have a few characters to play, and a few of these characters can have different starting decks, but I think there's only 3 characters, and the starting decks you have to unlock. So, yeah, I think the game is a little slow, and I wish there were just more things to do within the run. Currently, even though the core mechanics are pretty cool, all things considered, does get a little repetitive very quickly. So I can see this game getting more love and getting more things added to it, but currently it's going to be a C tier for me. All right, next up we've got Spiritfall. Spiritfall finally got its full release, and I played this game in early access a few months ago, and I was really excited for its full release. It's fully out, and I've got a few things to say about this game. First off, this is a traditional 2D action roguelike, but this really is a combat game. Now, we talked about another game that tried to do this approach, which was BlazBlue Entropy Effect, which was cool. And they kind of wanted to do like these combo things and kind of wanted to go for a traditional like combat game. This is the combat game roguelike. If you played Smash, you're gonna love this game. I was a competitive Smash player for a while, and genuinely me being good at Smash made me really good at this game as well, which is awesome. Every weapon pretty much is a different character. There's so many different moves you can do with each weapon. You have your up aerials, you have your forward aerial, you have your neutral aerial, you have your down attack, you have an up attack, you have your smash attack. Like, it really is Smash. It is Smash. But it's also Hades. It also does take a straight-up Hades approach. Each room, you're going to be offered a boon from the gods, and each boon is different, has different mechanics, and you can fuse them, and there's combo boons. Listen, I'm happy if people take this approach from Hades. I'm totally fine with it. There's so much room to doing some crazy stuff with that, with these mechanics, and the fact that it is copying Hades in that regard, but is very uniquely a combat game, which I really have not seen any roguelike be able to do very successfully. This straight up is like Smash. Look at that. That is straight up Smash. And you can even spike enemies if you know anything about Smash, which is really enjoyable. So the gameplay is amazing. And once again, usually when games have really, really solid gameplay, then they don't have much focus in the roguelike elements. But not this game. Not only is the core gameplay phenomenal, the roguelike elements are also amazing. You can do completely different runs with completely different weapons almost every time, depending on the boons you find and the different approaches you want to go for. Each of the different gods you can find will give you drastically different ways to play each of these weapons, which from just that by itself just gives so much replayability. Very similar to Hades in that regard. Different weapons with different boons can create completely different playstyles. Great sense of progression. Each world looks and feels very different. A lot of different bosses. The bosses are awesome. Even though I might be biased because of how much I love Smash as a whole, I think there's no other game that does this better. And it's still a phenomenal roguelike. So this is going to actually be a pretty easy S tier for me. There's a lot of things to unlock, a lot of secrets. Although I wish there could be even more secrets. There's a lot of content, I just want more content. Even though there's also a secret true boss that requires a lot of things to do in order to get to, and it's really, really hard fight. I'm just greedy, I want more. I kind of wish that every world could potentially have different variations of the bosses, because you're always fighting the same boss. And now you can upgrade those bosses with just that, kind of like the pact of whatever in Hades. Like, you can like press a button and then they're automatically much harder. But I kind of wish there was different variations of the set boss. Other than that, the game is amazing. And if you like Smash, definitely check Spiritfall. It's really solid. And I wish that the synergy blessings were more impactful. You're right about that. The synergy blessings are not super impactful. It's true that some of the blessings do feel a little underwhelming compared to Hades. I will give you that. That's true. I would put Hades above this game, and again, I am a little biased just because of the Smash aspect of it. That I think they did really, really well. I still think the game is great, but effectively, when you compare to Hades, yes, the boons are a little more underwhelming and more situational, and sometimes don't really like Sometimes you get 3 choices that are just all terrible, and that is not super fun. I agree. Next up, we've got Star of Providence. I think that's how you say Providence. This is a shooter game. Top-down shooter, very fast-paced. You play as this little spaceship, and you go from room to room, and you just kill different enemies. It's pretty much exactly what you expect from what you see. Now, I was pretty excited about this game. I heard I heard really good things about it, and I've got to say, I was quite disappointed. My main issue with this game is the gameplay itself. I play a lot of bullet hells, and I'm very comfortable with bullet hells. But the issue is how small the screen is and how fast the gameplay is, makes it so that if you don't know enemy movesets, you're going to take damage. Especially in the later bosses, you need to know the boss's movesets very well for you to be able to evade things. Even if you're very, very comfortable with bullet hell games, like myself, I tend to believe I'm quite comfortable with these games. This is a game that doesn't really feel very fair. It almost feels like trial and error with some of these bosses. You kind of need to understand how they work, and you don't have any time to react in this very, very small window of the screen, which is kind of frustrating. Also, there's a dash mechanic, and for a game that has such fast-paced gameplay, you would think that the dash would be able to evade, like you could like actually roll through bullets. No, the dash, if you roll into a bullet, you take damage, which I'm not a huge fan of. I feel like it would be honestly more interesting if that wasn't the case. You can find an upgrade that allows you to teleport instead of dash, but I feel like, honestly, I would have preferred it if it was part of the core mechanics of it instead of having to find an upgrade for it because of how insanely fast everything is. I didn't go too far within the game, and I know that I could get more comfortable and probably enjoy the game quite a bit once I get to know it. I do think it is important for games to be enjoyable from the start. It's just a little too punishing and feels a little unfair. Not to mention that losing health is pretty critical. It's really hard to gain health back. So when you do lose health from a boss that you just don't know enough of, it's gonna feel terrible because you can't really get that health back anymore. Every health you lose is kind of permanently lost. Because even if you're at max health, when you find health, you can increase your max health. So taking damage feels terrible. And this is a game where you're going to take a lot of damage. It's a bit of a shame because I feel like this game has a ton of content. And I can see there's a lot of hidden stuff around it. And I love games that have a lot of secrets and a lot of different worlds and different bosses. I might continue playing it because I'm so excited and intrigued with all of the different things that are within the game. SNES graphics, yeah, and I love the charm. I will say the visuals are great. They go for your classic, pixel art style, and I think it looks amazing in that regard. Next up, we've got Tales of Maj'Eyal. I'm laughing because I did an oopsie on my last tier list, and it was, out of like the 80 plus games, it was in it. And I remember when I was doing the tier list, I didn't have time to play it. So I thought I was gonna have time to cover it. And I forgot that I left it in the tier list. I was like, whatever. It's like, there's 80 games. People are just gonna see this one last game, but whatever. And I got so many comments about people saying, what about Taz? Like, it's there, but like, you haven't talked about it. Dude, you need to talk about it. Like, what the hell? I was like, fine, sorry. I'll play it and I'll talk about it. So, this is a classic RPG turn-based roguelike. If you're really talking about the traditional aspect of what a roguelike is, this is one, but more in modern times. This game is not for everybody. Of course, a lot of these turn-based games are not for everybody in general. And this game is really interesting. I understand why so many people love this game and why it is a cult favorite for many people. It is packed with stuff to do. It feels like a unique RPG experience every time. Honestly, people have said that you can get rid of the roguelike elements, it would just feel like a huge RPG game. That's how impressive it is in that regard. That being said, that does come with a bit of a caveat where you need to understand how to play the game, and it takes a long time to understand it. I did the tutorial. The tutorial is pretty extensive, and I was like, okay, I play a lot of turn-based strategy games. I get it. I've played a lot of traditional roguelikes, and then I started a new run, and I was put into a random cave, and there were like 4 enemies around, and I moved 1 step, and then 4 enemies did different spells, and then like there was a bunch of text, and like then there was like an enemy teleported, and then there was an explosion. I was like, what is going on? This game does require a lot of knowledge. It does require a bit of dedication to get comfortable with. I wish the random runs couldn't start the way they did for me, because it felt insanely overwhelming when I first started my first run. I wish the beginnings could be more minimalistic when you first start. Maybe there is an option for it, but if that's the case, it wasn't really indicated to me very easily. That being said, I stuck to it, and I got much more comfortable with the mechanics and all the stuff going on in this game. And yeah, I can understand that this is a really impressive RPG experience. This is another one of those games where if I had to be stuck playing 1 or 2 games for like many months, this would be one of them. And this would be one for many people. I understand that people have put hundreds of hours in this game, and I also understand that some people are just going to be very much discouraged by it from the start. This is not a game for everybody, but if you do like the classic roguelike experience, this is a classic for it, in my opinion. This is phenomenal. It does this very, very, very well. I am definitely excited to get to know the game more and more, because I'm definitely curious to see what I can uncover. Many classes, there's a ton to do in this game. It really is just a really solid RPG experience. I'm going to say that this is not a game I would recommend to many people. Also, oops, I forgot to rate Star of Providence. There you go. Sorry. I'm going to put Tales of Maj'Eyal as a low A tier. You need to be experienced with traditional roguelikes for you to probably enjoy this game. But if you do enjoy traditional roguelikes, you need to play this game. I haven't put that many hours into it, so honestly, I don't have as much to say about it than people that have played many, many, many hours of them. But from what I've played and from what I understand, and from understanding these kinds of games, this is a really, really good game. Next up, we've got The Void Reigns Upon Her Heart. That is the name of this game. Oh boy, this game. Okay, so you have to understand, I have played over 130 roguelikes in the last few years. Roguelikes is a great genre because there's so many different ways to approach how a roguelike is done in this day and age. And out of the 130 roguelikes that I've found, probably, I would say this is probably the most interesting game I've come across. This is one of the most interesting games I've ever seen. And I'm even considering making an entire video just talking about this game because of how interesting and honestly amazing this game is. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a bullet hell 2D shooter, as you can see, where the gimmick is you love your enemies. The story is really huge in this game, by the way. There's a huge emphasis on story. There's a lot of cutscenes, a lot of characters, and you're basically a character that is hated by everybody, but like everybody's corrupted by evil, I think. Basically, everybody is missing love. That's the problem. Something like that. It's very obscure. It's very interesting because it's all about love, but everything looks so dark and gloomy, which is kind of the point. I don't know how much I want to say in this game because I really do think I'm going to make a video to talk about this in more detail. But basically, the gameplay is very, very satisfying. This, I think, is one of the best bullet hell experiences I've ever had, and I love bullet hells. As you can see, the bullets are much slower, so you have a lot of control. It doesn't feel punishing. You can really see pretty much everything, which is great, especially compared to the Star of Providence that I was talking about. Here, you can really see the bullets coming, and you can evade them. That doesn't mean the game is easy. It is not easy, because there's a bunch of bullets, but the bullets are a little slower, so there's more care into precision than just spontaneously like seeing something and having to react instantly to it. The bullet hell experience is amazing. They did a really, really good job with the core gameplay of the game. This is a boss rush game, so you're going to be facing a bunch of bosses, and each bosses have different movesets. And each bosses can be fought in different levels, and each level not only increases the speed of bullets and their health and damage, but also changes their movesets. You're like, oh, okay, well, that's already a lot of content. How many bosses are there? Like 40? 50? There's like 100. There's 100 different monsters. Each of these monsters have very unique movesets, and each of these movesets will change depending on the level you're fighting them. It is ridiculous the amount of content this game has for a game like this. Usually you would not expect a game like this to have that much content. Not only that, there's a bunch of unlockables. And when I mean a bunch of unlockables, I can't overstate how many unlockables there are in this game. The game is based around the concept of unlockables. But interestingly enough, the unlockables are not roguelite elements. You don't upgrade your character, not necessarily. It's mostly to unlock more information about the monsters and the abilities that you encounter during your roguelike runs. Because yes, this is a roguelike. So basically you're gonna fight a monster, and then you're gonna choose another monster to fight, and whatever monster you fight, you're going to be given abilities. These abilities can be pretty impactful, but a lot of them are pretty kind of like whatever. They just do something automatically, which is fine, because again, this game really, really takes priority over the core gameplay rather than the roguelike elements. But even so, the roguelike elements are a really nice touch. There are some really cool abilities you can come across, and that can kind of change the way you play, which is great. This game has a really interesting approach in terms of unlockables. When you first start playing the game, the first monster you're going to fight is going to be shown as a question mark, and it's going to reward you with a question mark. And that's going to be the case for the first few hours, which might feel kind of weird because you're like, well, don't I want to try to build towards something specific? So you want to get more information about the abilities that you're being offered? Yes, but the game is divided really in two sections. The first few hours, you're just going to be playing without really knowing anything that you're going to be grabbing. Everything's going to be a question mark, which is fine because you're going to be seeing new abilities and new monsters, and it's always going to be new for a very, very long time. And as you play this game a lot, you're going to start unlocking these items in a way so you can actually see what they do every time you encounter them, so you can actually predict what you want to get before fighting a boss. And that's where the second part of the game comes in. Basically, the first part is this discovery, and the second part is, now that you've discovered a lot of things, you can actually try to plan to try to get some synergetic builds, which is great because the first section is just discovering a bunch of bosses, and then you can try to actually make the roguelike elements work, which is really cool. I've never really seen any game be able to do this successfully. That being said, even though I've played this game for, I think, 20 hours or so now, I'm still finding new bosses. I'm still finding new abilities. I'm still discovering new game modes. I'm still discovering new events. This game has so much content. I'm surprised that this game did not receive more love, no pun intended, because I think this game is phenomenal. It's really unique in many ways, which is always a plus in roguelikes. It does everything it tries to do really well. It's a great experience. You're always going to be discovering something new, and the bullet hell experience is some of the best I've ever seen. You're going to be evading things super well. You're going to feel so awesome for evading all these bullets. It's a lot of skill, but it's skill that you can learn, and it feels great. I find it to be one of the most interesting roguelikes I've ever seen, and this is going to be an S tier for me. I do have a few issues. I think it's mostly due to the panic attack system of the game, which is kind of the blank. If you think of Enter the Gungeon, basically you can have a certain amount of panic attacks, and if things go really bad, you can use a panic attack, and then like you absorb all the bullets around you. The mechanic around it is fine. The problem is that there are certain runs where you're giving so many of them that you can just stack, and then you're just going to be fighting the final boss with ease just because you're just spamming panic attacks. I kind of wish this might be like a huge difference, and I don't expect this to happen, but I almost wish that panic attacks would actually recharge between fights, but you weren't given as many of them. So you can use one per fight maybe, and they're way weaker, and you can upgrade them a little bit, but you can't basically end with 18 for the final fight, which happens to me fairly regularly. And then the final boss, which is awesome. I cannot stress how awesome the final bosses are. There are multiple of them, of course. They're really easy for me, even on higher difficulty, because I just kept all my panic attacks. I kind of wish that was done a little differently. Outside of that, I think this game deserves more love than any other game on this list. Please, if you do enjoy this kind of gameplay, you need to play this game. It is so impressive. Next up, we've got Tiny Rogues. I did talk about this game previously, but the last time I talked about it on the last tier list, it was in early access. I don't even know if it was in early access. What I do know is that they did such a huge update that the game honestly feels pretty different. And originally the game was very straightforward, very simple. It's a top-down dungeon crawler. You know, it's very basic, as you can see. I don't think I've ever seen that much content added to a game in one update. It's just that impressive. I already liked the original game, but now the game is really, really solid. There's a ton of things to do. So many weapons, so many builds, so many characters, so many secrets, so many bosses. There's an entire meta progression that was added. It's a new experience. The only issue I have with this change from the original is that originally one of the things I really liked about Tiny Rogues was the simplicity of it. Now, the game is still fairly simple mechanically, but items got very complicated, and there's a lot of stats to take into account. There were a lot of stats originally, but not as much as there are now. Now there's a ton of new keywords, and a lot of different classes and items really are very different from one another and have text and text of different abilities. So even though the mechanics are still the same and are still as simple as before, getting to understand all the different builds will take a bit more time. And that's the only problem I have with it, is that it's not as it's not as approachable anymore as it used to be. It still is very approachable. I would still recommend it to many people that want to get into it. But I would say, before I would just be like, oh, just play this game, it's awesome, if you don't know much about roguelikes. Now I would say you should definitely play it if you don't know much about roguelikes, but just don't be too intimidated by all the text that you will find. It's not as important as other things, and you will understand it eventually. So that's the only thing about it. Otherwise, the game is amazing, and I'm going to bump up its rating from a B to a solid A tier. I'm going to put it like above Atomicrops. Next up, we've got another re-rating of a past game. It's a pretty standard deck building experience. Originally, I played it for a few hours, and I wasn't a huge fan of it. I made that clear on my last tier list, and I got a ton of comments saying that, honestly, I should just try it more if I love deck building games. And the fact that I'm working on a deck building video right now, a deck building design video right now, I figured I should probably give this one a try again. I played it some more. I was wrong. This game is not only, I think I put it as a C tier, it's not only like pretty good, it's really solid. I actually think this deserves to be a low A tier. I just didn't put enough time into it, and I do think it is important for games to not always need time for it to be good. But I just think, out of the 130 plus games, I was just wrong. Even from the start, it's a good game. I just probably didn't play it during a time where I was really invested in this kind of gameplay. Maybe, I don't know. It's a good game. It's a very solid, basic deck building game. This is one that doesn't have really unique mechanics, which generally I would say is not great for deck building games, because then they will just be compared to Slay the Spire. But this is one of the few that just does it well. What can I say? It just does it well. It doesn't have anything crazy unique. There's a few different mechanics, of course, but overall, it's fairly similar to Slay the Spire in some aspects, but in others, it definitely has its own vibe. There's a lot of tiny little mechanical things within the game that make things very interesting. There's a bunch of cards, a bunch of artifacts, a ton of replayability. There's really a lot to do. So I'm really impressed with the amount of content there is in this game, and I was wrong. I think this game is really, really solid and deserves to be an A tier deck building game. Very solid game if you like deck building games. I wish I could tell that to myself for the last stream. Alas, I was wrong. Next up, we've got Wildfrost. This is another deck building game, as you can see, that is board focused. So you have cards in your hand, but you mostly place things on the board, kind of like Monster Train. All right, first things first, I adore the visuals. Man, do I love the visuals of this game. It is so immersive. That by itself is so impactful for me. I love the way the game looked. It definitely made me want to play it very, very quickly. And the music is phenomenal. I love the music. During this tier list right now, I think 3 or 4 of the tracks are from Wildfrost because it's just that good. Gameplay-wise, it's very simple, which is nice because you only get to play 1 card a turn. Now, if you like Monster Train, that's a very interesting comparison. Monster Train really focuses a lot on like strategy of every turn. You really have to do like some specific things and different combinations of cards. Here, there's a lot of strategy. There definitely is a lot of strategy, but it's very simple in concept. And I think that's a really good thing because I think it's much more approachable for a lot of people that want to get into this style. Every turn, you place some units, and then the enemy's turns go, and then your turn, you play 1 card, then the enemy's turn, and then 1 card, and then enemy's turn. Each unit, enemy and friendly unit, will have a little number under their character. That's the amount of turns they need before they can actually do their action. So even though you're constantly going from one turn to the other, they're not constantly attacking each other. So it's an interesting pacing as a whole. You play one thing at a time, but every time you play something, units are going to start acting as you pass your turn. The problem I have is this is, I think, the only deck building game I've ever found that does not have cards with rarities. Nothing has rarities. What this means is that you're as likely to find this card as this card. There's no difference between any card. This is really interesting, and I find it kind of odd. When you go and unlock these units right there, you can find any unit, doesn't matter. They're all theoretically of even power. And I think that actually hinders the game a little bit. I do like the concept. I mean, you know, it's different that you don't have rarities. It's kind of unusual. But what ends up happening is that it makes things quite inconsistent and pretty random in terms of what you find. And it doesn't make you feel as lucky when you find like a really cool card in the mid game that's like rare and very situational. It makes having particular runs a little less consistent and not as satisfying because everything is just kind of random. Now, the gameplay is not random at all, which is great. The only random aspect is the cards you draw. But honestly, in terms of deck building, in terms of the deck building aspect, this is one of the least RNG focused games. Like when you're in a game, like everything can really be figured out strategically, which is great. It's just what you find in your deck is pretty random because of the lack of rarity. But that's probably the only problem I have with this game. Because outside of that, the game is really, really fun with a bunch of different builds. The fact that you don't have the rarities means that there's actually less cards. I wish there were more units. I think the game really could have double the amount of cards and double the amount of units. Outside of that, the game is super satisfying, very fun, beautiful, great soundtrack. There's an awesome progression system. Once you beat the final boss will then become your last run's deck, and you have to fight that, but upgrade it. It's a really cool concept that doesn't sound like it would work, but it actually does work quite well. And then if you beat the game on its highest difficulty, which is really hard, you're going to find the true final boss. And I can't think of a final boss that's been this hard in a long time. If you're trying to go for that, good luck. It is very satisfying when you beat it, but oh boy. Overall, this is a really solid game with a little issue that I have that many people might not have. I think it would personally, to me, be a better game if it had better, like a better rarity system. That being said, it's still an amazing game that I've played a ton of, and I think 100%ed to an extent. So I'm going to put this as a very solid A tier. In my opinion, it helps the game since there's not that much variety. This way, your skill develops as you learn to adapt to what the game gives you. That's fair. That there is that side, but if that were to be the case, then I wish there were more cards so that you could really have to adapt to different playstyles, because there's not enough cards. So you still end up finding pretty much whatever build you kind of want to go for, but it's just not as consistent. It's just kind of like a weird limbo for me between just not having enough cards and the fact that there's no rarity makes it kind of random with all of these small amount of cards, all things considered, for a card game to have. I can see your point, but I personally myself would feel like I would have a better time if there was a different system when you find new cards. Because a lot of the times you're going to be offered 3 minions, you're like, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, and then you realize all of them here are completely useless or not very interesting, or just don't really work super well with your build, and there's just not much you can do about it. You don't encounter these as often as other deck building games out there. So that's kind of my issue with it, and I think the rarity system would probably help with that. That being said, again, I understand if some people are fine with the way it is. I love the game myself. It is a nice A tier, so even though I have an issue with it, it's still a phenomenal game for me. Last game, cued with the music once again perfectly. We've got Wizard with a Gun. I was very excited for this game. It said it was a roguelike. It's not really a roguelike. It depends how you want to interpret it. This is more of an adventure. It's just a campaign kind of thing. I'm going to review it a little bit differently than other games, I would say, because I can't complain about the roguelike elements as much. This is more of a exploration. You find materials, and with materials you go back to your hub world and you create and forge things. There's a big building portion of it, kind of like in Cult of the Lamb, where you have your own base and you can create a lot of stuff, including mostly a lot of things for the gameplay. To an extent, there are some comparisons to Cult of the Lamb, but probably not the way we want to think about that. You're going to be exploring the world, and you're going to be finding different biomes, and each biomes will offer different materials, and then with these different materials, you can create different things. I like these kind of games, but unfortunately for me, I thought the game was very repetitive. Here's my issue, is a lot of these games, when you go to a new biome and you find new materials, sometimes the materials are just a different version of the same material you've been getting this entire time to upgrade the same kind of gun, but with just better stats. And that's kind of how this game is to me. When I started, it was really exciting. I would find, ooh, a new gun, and then I would try this new gun, and then I put like a new modifier to it, and that's great. And then when I get to a new biome, every new material is just to upgrade the same guns. So the biomes just feel very similar to another in terms of gameplay. You're going to be looking for the same things, and you're going to be fighting similar monsters and upgrading similar things. And unfortunately, the gameplay didn't really feel like it changed that much from biome to biome. And it felt very repetitive. Now, that being said, one thing I do enjoy is the whole adventure side of it. Because there is a lot, you can see that this game is like climbing to something. You're definitely building to something. Sorry, that's a better term. It was really exciting for me to see the different bosses I was going to find. The beginning is really exciting because you find new guns to try and new upgrades to put into your gun. But eventually, by the mid game, you're just upgrading these things. You can change your loadout, but there's no real reason to. If you like one loadout, you can just stick to it, and you just upgrade it just to the next level, and the next level, and the next level. And that's what all the biomes do. Just upgrade them to the next level. That's how it felt to me. Also, the gameplay itself is pretty basic. You know, you're just moving around, you can roll, and you can shoot. It's very similar to Don't Starve. But I think Don't Starve, you would have more unique things to find, as opposed to just upgrading the same thing you've been doing this entire time. So that is my biggest issue. This is the kind of game where you go to a new biome, all the stuff from the previous biome, mostly you're just gonna scrap. You can use them for certain things, but it's mostly like, okay, now you got the new biome, these are all the stuff you want, and then you do all your upgrades with this stuff. You go to a new biome, like, okay, now this is all the stuff you want, and you can kind of put these aside, maybe use a little bit for one thing here and there. You get the idea. That was kind of my issue with it. So I love the visuals. I love the art style. I love the vibe it's going for. I love the music, and I love the exploration part of it and the whole adventure this game has. But unfortunately, I just got pretty bored of the gameplay. Now, that being said, I do believe this is a much better experience multiplayer. But again, you know, these games are also single player. I'm going to rate them as a single player experience. I'm going to put it as a very low B tier, mostly because I love the aesthetics and the vibe. The overall theme of the game was awesome. That saves it from being a C tier for me. If people love it, good for you guys. I respect pretty much all of these games. Even though it's a low B, I don't think it's a bad game. I was just kind of personally disappointed, and I guess it wasn't what I was personally expecting, and I was hoping for a little bit more variety throughout the campaign. Don't Starve is a lot harder. Instead of just having enemies to worry about, yes, you're right. Don't Starve is a lot more in the survival aspect. This is more just exploration and just shoot and come back. And that's about it. I think overall, some really, really solid games. Especially since these games are not super popular compared to the last tier list I did. Thank you all so much for watching and for joining me on the stream. If you like this kind of content, talking about game design for roguelikes and all that stuff, I stream fairly regularly, and I do videos on game design. So feel free to subscribe. Feel free to give the video a like. It really does help. I really appreciate it. And yeah, once again, I'm really hungry, so I'm just gonna leave now.